Welcome to Luke's Stories, where camping isn't all about campfires and stars, but also nightmares in the dark. My name's Randy Smith, and back in 2019, I took my trusty old RV up to the quiet stretches of Moosehead Lake in Maine. I'm the kind of guy who thinks that the best kind of alarm clock is the sun peeking through the trees, though I still pack instant coffee because roughing it shouldn't mean suffering. I had been working non-stop for months, and the idea of escaping into nature sounded like the perfect remedy. My friends joked that I'd last a day without Wi-Fi, but I was determined to prove them wrong. The open road was calling, and who was I to decline? The drive was smooth, with the kind of scenery that makes you forget about emails and deadlines. Pine trees lined the roads, and the air smelled cleaner with every mile I covered. When I finally reached Moosehead Lake, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the water. It was picturesque, like a postcard you'd send just to make people jealous. I found a secluded spot by the lake to park my RV. There were a few other campers scattered around, but everyone seemed to keep to themselves. After settling in, I decided to stretch my legs and take a walk along the shoreline. The water was so clear you could see the pebbles at the bottom, and the gentle lapping of the waves was the kind of white noise that could put you to sleep. As I walked, I noticed an old man fishing off a small pier. He wore a weathered hat and had a beard that would make Santa Claus envious. I gave him a nod. "Any luck today?" I asked. He looked up, his eyes squinting against the fading light. "Plenty of fish in this lake," he replied, "but sometimes it's not about the catch." I chuckled. "Sounds like something a guy who hasn't caught anything would say." He grinned. "Fair enough, but out here it's the peace that counts." We chatted for a bit. His name was Walter, a local who had been fishing these waters for decades. He told me about the best spots to watch the sunrise and where to find trails that weren't on any map. There was something comforting about his presence, like talking to an old friend you hadn't seen in years. As the night crept in, I headed back to my RV. I cooked up some canned chili, not exactly gourmet, but it did the job. Settling into my camp chair, I watched as the stars began to dot the sky. Without the glare of city lights, they seemed so much brighter, almost close enough to touch. Just as I was considering turning in for the night, I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby, probably a raccoon or some other critter looking for scraps. I made a mental note to secure the trash before heading to bed. The next morning, I woke up early, determined to catch the sunrise Walter had mentioned. Armed with a thermos of coffee, I made my way to the spot, a small clearing overlooking the lake. The sky was painted in hues of pink and orange, the kind of beauty that makes waking up at dawn worthwhile. As I sipped my coffee, I noticed something floating near the shore. It looked like a bundle of clothes caught on a branch. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked down to take a closer look. As I approached, my stomach tightened. It wasn't clothes, it was a backpack. I pulled it from the water and set it on the ground. It was soaked, but I could make out a name tag, Emily. Inside there was a wallet, some granola bars, and a map of the area. No phone, though. Maybe someone lost it while canoeing, I thought. I decided to take it back to the main campsite later, figuring someone might be looking for it. On my way back, I ran into Walter again. "Morning," I called out. "Found someone's backpack in the lake. Know anyone named Emily?" His face grew serious. "Emily? Can't say I do. Might belong to one of the hikers." "Planning to drop it off at the ranger station," I said. "Good idea," he replied, but there was a hint of concern in his voice. The rest of the day was uneventful. I hiked one of the trails Walter had recommended and took some photos that would surely make my friends back home jealous. By the time I returned, the sun was beginning to dip again. Back at the campsite, there was a bit of a commotion. A couple of park rangers were talking to campers, showing them a photo. When they reached me, one of them asked, "Excuse me, sir, have you seen this woman?" He held out a picture of a young woman with curly brown hair and a bright smile. Underneath the name Emily Parker was printed. My heart skipped a beat. "I haven't seen her, but I found this backpack near the lake this morning," I said, handing it over. The rangers exchanged glances. "Where exactly did you find this?" I pointed in the direction of the clearing right by the shore, caught on a branch. They thanked me and moved on. A missing person wasn't exactly the kind of excitement I was looking for on this trip. That evening, as I was grilling some sausages, Walter wandered over. "Heard about the girl," he said. "Yeah, it's unsettling," I replied. "Makes you realize how vast this place is." He nodded slowly. "These woods have a way of swallowing people up. Gotta be careful." There was an awkward silence. To lighten the mood, I said, "Well, if I get lost, at least I've got enough canned chili to survive for a week." Walter gave a half smile. "Just don't wander too far off the trails." As night fell, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the missing girl, or perhaps the way Walter seemed uneasy. I decided to turn in early. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud bang on the side of my RV. My first thought was that a tree branch had fallen. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously stepped outside. The night was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. I scanned the area but saw nothing unusual. Just as I was about to head back in, I heard muffled voices coming from deeper in the woods. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there?" No response. Probably other campers, I told myself, but at this hour I decided to investigate, partly out of concern, partly because my curiosity always got the better of me, a trait that had landed me in hot water more than once. I followed the sound of the voices, which grew clearer but remained indistinct. They seemed to be coming from an old trail that veered away from the main paths. As I moved deeper into the woods, the trees grew denser, and the canopy above blocked out most of the moonlight. I was relying entirely on my flashlight now. "Maybe this isn't the best idea," I muttered. Just as I was about to turn back, I heard a sharp cry, a woman's voice. "Hello, are you okay?" I shouted, picking up my pace. The underbrush was thick, and I stumbled several times. The beam of my flashlight danced erratically, casting long shadows that played tricks on my eyes. I broke into a small clearing and froze. There was a cabin I hadn't seen before. Its wooden walls were aged and covered in moss. A faint light flickered from inside. Approaching cautiously, I peered through a grimy window. What I saw made my blood run cold. Inside, a man was pacing back and forth. He was tall, with unkempt hair and a scraggly beard. On a table beside him were various knives and tools laid out meticulously, but what caught my attention was the figure tied to a chair. Emily. Her head was slumped forward, and her arms were bound behind her. She looked battered but alive. I had to act, but charging in wasn't an option. I reached into my pocket for my phone, but of course there was no signal out here. I needed a plan. Retreating a few steps, I tried to think. Maybe I could create a distraction or find something to use as a weapon. Just then, I stepped on a twig, and the snap echoed louder than a gunshot in the silence. The door of the cabin swung open. The man stepped out, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Who's there?" he barked. I ducked behind a tree, holding my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. He took a few steps forward, holding a hatchet in his hand. "I know someone's out there," he growled. I needed to lead him away from the cabin. Picking up a stone, I tossed it into the bushes off to my right. It rustled loudly. He snapped his head toward the sound and started moving in that direction. Seizing the opportunity, I crept around the other side of the cabin, entering quietly. I approached Emily. Up close, I could see bruises on her face. Her eyes fluttered open as I touched her shoulder. "Shh! I'm here to help," I whispered, starting to untie her hands. She nodded weakly. "He'll be back any second," she murmured. "Not if I can help it." Just as I loosened the ropes, I heard footsteps approaching. "Change of plans," I said, helping her to her feet. "We need to hide." We slipped behind a tattered curtain just as the door swung open. The man stormed in, clearly agitated. "I know someone's been snooping around," he spat. He moved toward the chair, noticing the ropes were undone. "Clever girl," he hissed. Holding my breath, I gripped a rusty pipe I had found leaning against the wall. Emily was trembling beside me. The man started tearing the place apart, overturning furniture and kicking open cabinets. "You can't hide forever," he shouted as he moved closer to our hiding spot. I knew we had to make a move. I tightened my grip on the pipe. Just as he yanked the curtain aside, I swung with all my might. The pipe connected with his shoulder, and he staggered back with a grunt. "Run!" I yelled to Emily. We bolted out the door, sprinting into the darkness. Behind us I could hear him recovering, his footsteps thundering as he gave chase. The woods were a maze, but adrenaline fueled our escape. Branches whipped against my face, and the uneven ground threatened to trip us at every turn. "There's a road up ahead!" Emily panted. "Keep going." A sudden sharp pain shot through my leg as I stumbled over a root. I hit the ground hard. Emily stopped to help me up. "No time," I gasped. "You keep running." She shook her head. "Not a chance." We could hear him crashing through the underbrush, getting closer. Desperate, I looked around and spotted a fallen tree limb, a hefty one. "Help me lift this," I said. Together we propped it up at an angle between two trees, creating a makeshift trap. "Hide!" I told her. We crouched behind a thicket just as he burst into the small clearing. He paused, listening. Come out, wherever you are," he taunted as he stepped forward. His foot caught under the raised limb. With a heave I pushed it down, causing him to trip and fall hard onto the ground. The hatchet flew from his hand. Seizing the moment, I grabbed the hatchet. He rolled over, eyes wide as he realized I was now armed. "Stay back!" I warned, though my hands were shaking. He sneered. "You don't have it in you." He lunged at me and instinct took over. I swung the hatchet, not aiming, just reacting. It connected with his arm and he howled in pain. "Let's go," Emily screamed. We ran again, the sounds of his curses fading as we put distance between us. After what felt like hours, we broke through the tree line onto a gravel road. Headlights appeared in the distance. A ranger vehicle. We flagged them down frantically. The ranger, a middle-aged woman named Officer Reynolds, stepped out. "What happened?" she asked, eyeing our disheveled appearance. "There's a man. He's back there. He took her," I said, pointing into the woods. Emily nodded. "He's dangerous. We need help." Reynolds radioed for backup and ushered us into the vehicle. As we drove back toward the main station, more patrol cars sped past us toward the area. At the station, they took our statements. Emily told them how she had been hiking when the man attacked her, dragging her to the cabin. She'd been there for 2 days. "Do you know who he is?" I asked one of the officers. They exchanged glances. "We've had reports of a drifter matching that description," one said. "Name's Victor Strand, wanted in connection with several assaults up north." "Well, he's more than a drifter," I replied. "He's a psychopath." They assured us they would do everything to apprehend him. Emily was taken to a hospital for evaluation, and they offered me a place to rest for the night. The next morning, Officer Reynolds informed me that they had found the cabin but no sign of Victor. "We did find evidence linking him to other missing persons cases," she said grimly. "So he's still out there," I murmured. She nodded. "But we're on high alert now. He won't get far." I decided it was time to cut my trip short. As much as I loved the serenity of nature, I figured I'd had enough excitement to last me a lifetime. As I was packing up my RV, Walter appeared one last time. "Heard about what happened," he said. "News travels fast around here." I replied. He looked out toward the lake. "Be careful out there. The world isn't as peaceful as we'd like to think." I gave a small smile. "You can say that again." With everything loaded, I took one last look at Moosehead Lake. It was still as beautiful as when I arrived, but now it held a darkness I couldn't quite shake. Climbing into the driver's seat, I started the engine. As I pulled onto the road, I couldn't help but think about Victor Strand, where he came from, what led him down such a dark path. But that was a story for someone else to uncover. My name is Lawrence Mosby, and this went down back in 2020 up in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, just south of the Tennessee border. I thought a solo trip would be a chance to clear my head, just me and my RV out in the middle of nowhere, away from spreadsheets, conference calls, and city noise. I'd always been a bit of a weekend warrior, used to little hikes here and there, but this time I was determined to go all in and actually live in the park for a week. I'd parked my RV at the Elkmont campground, which has this mix of historic cabins and scattered RV sites nestled under thick trees, quiet except for the usual wildlife sounds. A ranger passed by my campsite when I first arrived, casually warning me that the season had seen an unusual amount of activity. His words vague enough to mean anything. He probably caught the blank look on my face because he added, "Just be careful around the trails, okay?" Before disappearing back up the path. A couple of days in, and I'd slipped into the rhythm of park life. Early morning hikes, lazy afternoons by the fire, and long nights under the stars. It was exactly what I needed. I even made friends with a couple parked a few sites down, Sam and Ellie, who'd been RVing around the country for the past 6 months. They had this casual charm about them, like they'd lived a dozen lives already, and didn't care who knew it. One night, after a particularly good meal and a beer by the fire, Sam suggested we take a quick walk up an old ranger trail he'd heard about. I could see the idea spark something in him, maybe the kind of thrill-seeking spirit only a guy who's driven through backcountry roads his whole life would think was a good idea. Against my better judgment and Ellie's eye roll, I shrugged and said I'd tag along. We grabbed a flashlight, leaving Ellie behind, who muttered something about wanting to stay back with her book. Sam and I headed up our path, dimly lit by my flashlight and the weak light of his phone. The ranger trail was overgrown with thick underbrush on either side, the air thick with that distinct smell of damp wood and soil. The silence felt weighty, but I pushed the thought aside, blaming the unease on city boy jitters. As we hiked up, the forest closed in, tree trunks looming like silent giants, their tangled branches forming odd shadowy shapes in the weak glow. Every so often, Sam would make a half-edged joke to lighten the mood, something about how he could already imagine Ellie reading his eulogy if we got lost. I'd laugh, but it was strained. Something about the air felt wrong. The forest felt too still, like it was holding its breath. We came across something strange about a mile in. An abandoned tent, collapsed and half buried under leaves and debris. Sam poked at it with his boot, half laughing. "Think someone ditched the camping life for a motel? Probably just some hiker who got spooked by a bear," I said, glancing around, but even as I said it, I felt an itch in the back of my mind, like something was off. Why would anyone leave a tent half collapsed and scattered? We kept moving, pushing deeper into the trail. After a while, Sam stopped suddenly, shining his phone on something half hidden by a pile of branches. It looked like a backpack, weathered and dirty, with a name tag Adams written in marker on one of the straps. "Odd place to lose a bag," Sam said, frowning. He squatted down, flipping open the top pocket. Maps, a first aid kit, basic stuff. Looks like it's been here a while. We heard the crack of a branch behind us, sharp and loud in the quiet night. I turned, scanning with my flashlight, catching nothing but empty woods and shadows. My nerves were starting to get the better of me. I chuckled nervously, saying, "Guess the park ranger was right about all the activity." But there was no laugh from Sam this time. "Hey, man," he said slowly, rising to his feet, his face tight with concern. "Let's get back to camp." I didn't argue. We started back down the trail at a quicker pace, both of us keenly aware of every rustle, every snap from the dark trees around us. The flashlight beam dotted from side to side as we hurried, trying to find some sense of normalcy in the oppressive quiet. Then we heard footsteps, heavy, unhurried, matching our pace as if they were right on top of us, but somehow still hidden. I muttered, "Is that a bear?" "No bear walks like that, man," Sam replied, his voice shaking. Another crack, this time much closer, made us freeze in place. I swung the flashlight wildly, catching a flash of something, someone standing among the trees. He was barely visible, dressed in a dark coat, his face obscured by a hood pulled low. He didn't move, just stood there, watching us in silence. "Let's go! Let's go!" Sam whispered, yanking on my sleeve. We stumbled down the trail, adrenaline surging. I dared a glance back, and he was still there, barely lit by my flashlight's dying beam, standing perfectly still, like he was carved out of the forest itself. As we neared the trailhead, the man's footsteps started again, heavy and rhythmic, closer than before. Sam was already ahead, but I stopped when I heard something different. A second set of footsteps, quick and light, like someone running. They were coming from my left, off the path. My flashlight flickered just as I caught sight of a girl darting through the trees, her face pale and streaked with dirt. She was whispering, desperate and quiet. "Help me, please." The words sent chills through me. I started toward her, calling, "Hey, hold on." But she looked past me, her expression frozen in pure terror, and bolted. The heavy footsteps returned, pounding behind me. I didn't look back. I sprinted, catching up to Sam, and we burst out onto the campground, gasping for breath. Ellie was waiting, her face tight with worry. "What the hell happened? You two looked like you saw a ghost." "Not a ghost," Sam muttered, his voice strained. "Just someone." Before I could explain further, we heard the faint crunch of leaves from the trail's edge. The man in the coat stepped out, standing just beyond the campground lights. His head tilted, like he was considering us. He didn't speak, didn't gesture, just stared, unblinking. "Hey!" Sam yelled, brandishing the flashlight like a weapon. "You need to leave." The man didn't react. He just turned and walked back up the trail, disappearing into the trees. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. The rest of the night passed uneasily. I hardly slept, my mind racing through every possible explanation, each more disturbing than the last. Morning finally came, and we packed up, determined to put miles between us and that place. As we left, we passed a ranger at the entrance. I mentioned what we'd seen, hoping for some logical explanation. He listened, then sighed. "You're not the first to report strange sightings up there," he said, his face grim. "There have been disappearances, people going missing without a trace. Officially, we say it's wildlife or accidents." He trailed off, his eyes darkening. "But what I wanted to ask, I already knew I wouldn't get an answer that would help me sleep any better. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the image of that girl's terrified face, her desperate whispers still echoing in my ears. There are easier ways to get mauled to death than being a park ranger, but none is poetic, right? It was 1998. I'd been on the job for 9 years at the Mount Baker Wilderness in Washington, working mainly to avoid staring at the walls of my one-bedroom apartment in Bellingham. My mother said I had a knack for picking careers that would either kill me or make me miserable, sometimes both, depending on the day. I didn't come into this job thinking it'd be all about wildlife conservation and peaceful mountain views. It was more about trying to distract myself from the fact that I wasn't the kind of guy who could sit at a desk and push papers around. I liked the outdoors, and I thought, why not turn that into a paycheck? But this wasn't about me wanting to save the world. It was about surviving. And I'm not talking about the bears or mountain lions. I'm talking about the quiet nights when your own thoughts creep in like an unwelcome guest. It started as a pretty standard morning. I was patrolling the western edge of the park near Mount Chuksan, checking out a report of illegal camping from some out-of-state hunters. It's the kind of thing that usually ends with me asking folks to pack up their gear and get lost. Maybe issuing a fine if they give me too much attitude. But by the time I got to the spot, it was obvious nobody had been camping. The place looked trashed, food wrappers, broken bottles, even a half-buried jacket. It was like they'd left in a hurry. The thing that got me was the smell. It was subtle at first, like a roadkill deer baking in the sun for too long, but as I got closer to the clearing, it hit me full force. My stomach did a little backflip, and I had to steady myself against a tree. I thought maybe a bear had dragged something out here, but it didn't smell right for that. Bears leave a more metallic, almost clean smell if they've gotten to something fresh. This was different. Rancid, like something that had been sitting for days, rotting with no one to care. I radioed into headquarters, telling them I might have found a poaching site or something worse, and I'd take a closer look. Standard procedure, right? Even then, I had a knot in my gut telling me to get the hell out. But you don't quit the job because of a bad feeling, especially when bad feelings are part of the job. The first body wasn't too far from where I stood. At first, I thought it was just a heap of old clothes, but when I got closer, I could see the outline of a leg sticking out from under the pile. My brain did its best to rationalize it. It was a dummy or someone passed out drunk. But no, this was real. It was a man, face down, his arms bent at weird angles like he'd tried to fight off whatever had attacked him. I didn't need to flip him over to know he was dead, but I did. Part of me regrets that. His face, or what was left of it, looked like it had been peeled back by something that didn't care to finish the job. His chest was torn open, ribs visible, like a predator had feasted, but not any predator I'd ever seen. Not clean, like a mountain lion. This was messy, violent, unrestrained. A kill for the sake of it, not for hunger. The second body was a few feet away, hidden under the remains of what looked like a sleeping bag. This one was a woman, or what was left of one. Her limbs had been taken. That's the only word for it. Torn off at the joints, and not in a way that a bear or a wolf would do it. It was like someone or something had wrenched them off, leaving nothing but ragged stumps. The blood had dried into the dirt around her, and there were tracks, large, deep impressions in the ground that led off into the forest. I don't know what made me follow them. Call it stupidity, call it curiosity, maybe a bit of both. I didn't grab my rifle from the truck because in my mind there was no animal big enough in these woods to warrant it. That turned out to be my first mistake of the day. The tracks led deeper into the woods, through underbrush that had been torn apart like something huge had barreled through the trees. Too massive. Firs had deep gouges in them, like something had raked them with claws the size of my forearm. I kept going, the smell of death growing stronger. Then I heard something, a low, guttural noise, not quite a growl, more like a rumble of displeasure, like something big was annoyed I was there. In front of me, maybe 50 yards off, was a cave, barely noticeable if you weren't looking for it. I don't know why I didn't turn back then. Maybe it was the sound of a third body groaning from inside the cave. Someone was alive. At least that's what I told myself. I inched closer, heart thudding, and that's when I saw it. It came out of the cave, stooping to fit its massive frame under the low ceiling. At first glance, I thought it was a bear, but that was just my brain scrambling for something familiar to latch onto. This wasn't a bear. It was wrong. Too long, too lean, and its face wasn't right. It had the basic structure of something mammalian, but its jaws were extended, its teeth, well, too many of them and too sharp. A nightmare of mismatched parts, as if evolution had taken a wrong turn somewhere. It saw me, and for a second we just stared at each other. I remember thinking about how bad my breath smelled and what a terrible last thought that would be. Then it moved fast. Before I even had a chance to think, it was charging at me. I'm not proud of it, but I ran. I didn't even reach for my sidearm because I knew it wouldn't matter. This thing wasn't something you killed with a couple of shots. I don't remember much of the sprint back, just trees blurring by and the sound of branches breaking behind me. That thing was fast, too fast for something that size. I hit the truck, flung myself into the driver's seat, and gunned it. The drive back to the station felt like a fever dream. My mind was racing, adrenaline pumping so hard I could barely feel my hands on the wheel. I should have gone back for the bodies, but all I could think about was getting the hell out of there. When I reached the station, I burst in like a madman, rambling about what I'd seen. No one believed me, of course. It's not like you can walk into a ranger station and start babbling about some unknown creature without getting a few sideways looks. They sent out a search team the next day. I wasn't part of it, thank God. But when they came back, they had no bodies, no sign of anything strange, just the remains of a campsite that looked like a bunch of bears had trashed it. Of course, that's the story they told the press. The hikers missing, vanished into thin air. I left that job a year later. Maybe it was cowardice, maybe it was just self-preservation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been marked by that thing. Like it had let me go, but only because it was toying with me. I moved to the city, got an office job, and started living like a regular person. But sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I swear I can hear that rumble again, and I wonder if it's out there waiting for me to come back. My name's Terry Mason, and back in 2020 I decided to set out on what I thought was just going to be a peaceful camping trip. I'd rented an RV and was headed up to the Boundary Waters in Minnesota, one of the last real wilderness areas left in the Midwest. I'd just gone through a messy breakup, one of those the dog stays with me deals, and thought that getting into the thick of nature might clear my head. Of course, I thought I'd be on my own for a few days, doing nothing more than fishing, grilling, maybe reading a bad detective novel. I wasn't really prepared for anything out of the ordinary. I mean, who would be? So there I was, parked at a site that was basically as far out as my RV could take me. Not a single soul in sight. Just me and the trees pressing close, the smell of pine and the sounds of wind rushing through thick branches. I had my own little campfire going, cooking a half-burned hot dog and poking at the coals with a stick. The campsite was wedged between a rock face and a narrow trail that led into a small valley. The only access road was a twisting, barely there dirt path, something you'd need four-wheel drive just to crawl through, which was exactly why I'd chosen it. I figured it would be a nice, quiet evening, maybe even boring. Around dusk, though, I heard something in the distance. At first, I brushed it off as a deer or some animal rustling in the brush, but it got louder. It was the kind of sound that sticks in your gut because it's too out of place, not the typical crunch or snap of branches you'd expect, but something else, something heavier and somehow purposeful. I tried to laugh it off, muttering something dumb to myself like, "All right, Bigfoot, don't make me come over there." But the noise kept going, each crunch louder, closer, then silence. The kind of silence where you feel like the whole world's holding its breath. Out of nowhere, a man just walked right into my camp as if he belonged there. No warning, no hello, just there he was. Tall, wiry, with a face that looked like it had been whittled out of driftwood. He wore an old military jacket, camo pants, and heavy black boots caked in dried mud. His hair hung down like dirty straw, and there was something off about him. The way he stood too still, staring right at me with this dead expression, like he'd seen the worst things imaginable and carried them with him. "Got any spare firewood?" he asked, his voice low and scratchy, barely above a whisper. I don't know why, but my instinct was to play it cool. I told him, "Sure, there's some by the fire," and gestured to a small pile next to my cooler. He just stared at me, unsmiling, before he picked up a few pieces and stacked them onto my fire like he owned it. Then he sat down across from me, close enough that I could see the dirt under his nails. "Nice spot you got here," he said, still not looking away. "Yeah," I mumbled, trying to keep things light. "Good place to get some peace and quiet. Not many folks around." "Peace is what people say they're after until they find it," he replied, poking the fire with a stick. I laughed awkwardly, wondering what he was on about. He just sat there, still, like he was waiting for something. After a few more minutes of awkward silence, I tried to steer the conversation back to normal, asking if he was camping nearby. He didn't answer immediately, just stared at the flames as if he hadn't heard me. Finally, he looked up, fixing me with this unnervingly blank look. "I don't camp," he said, his voice steady, cold. "I'm just passing through, following an old path." It was at that point I started feeling like I might have made a mistake coming up here alone. This guy, whoever he was, didn't seem like someone who'd gotten lost on a weekend getaway. He felt intentional, the way he just sat there, his words dripping out slow, his gaze dark and unblinking. I cleared my throat, trying to break the spell. "Well, I'm heading out tomorrow anyway. Got to get back to civilization, right?" I said, forcing a laugh. The man didn't blink. "You sure about that?" Now here's the thing. I was getting uncomfortable, but I didn't want to look like I was afraid of him, especially when we were miles from anyone who'd hear me if I yelled. Instead, I tried to play it off, leaning back in my chair and cracking another cheap joke about Bigfoot. But the man didn't laugh. He just kept staring at me, his gaze sharpening, as if he was sizing me up. Then he asked, "You ever feel like something's watching you out here?" "Not really," I lied, though by now my skin was crawling. I shrugged and took a long sip from my bottle, hoping he'd take the hint and move along. But he didn't. Instead, he leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "They come out at night, you know, the quiet ones, the ones who don't belong anywhere else. You don't see them, but they see you. They know when you're alone." I tried to keep my face neutral, though inside every instinct I had was screaming at me to get away. But what was I going to do? Just get up and walk into the trees with him sitting right there? So I sat there, trapped, my mind racing, waiting for him to give up and go. Eventually he stood up, and I felt this rush of relief, until he looked down at me and said, "Careful, not everything that goes into the woods comes back out." With that, he turned and walked off, disappearing down the path toward the valley. For a few minutes, I just sat there, feeling a strange mix of relief and disbelief. I kept telling myself that he was just some weirdo, that I'd laugh about it later. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every sound, every whisper of leaves felt like it had a purpose, like it was waiting for me to let my guard down. Sometime around midnight, I heard the noise again, louder this time. I got up, grabbed my flashlight and scanned the area. Nothing but shadows. I almost convinced myself it was all in my head until I caught a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye, someone ducking behind a tree. I yelled out, "Who's there?" hoping I sounded more intimidating than I felt. No answer. I shone the flashlight in the direction where I'd seen the movement, and that's when I saw it, a small pile of sticks arranged in a circle right by the edge of my campsite, like some kind of makeshift trap or marker. And right in the center was my old pocket knife, one I'd left back in the RV. I didn't waste another second. I spun around, scrambling back to the RV as fast as I could. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, and I barely managed to get the door shut before I heard footsteps crunching outside. Inside, I locked everything I could, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. I peered out through one of the windows just in time to see him standing there in the beam of my flashlight I'd dropped. He didn't even look angry, just determined. Without taking his eyes off the RV, he reached down, picked up my flashlight, and flicked it off, plunging everything into darkness. My whole body froze. I didn't know what to do, so I just waited, every nerve on edge, listening for any sound, any clue. Then, like some horror movie cliché, I heard the slow scrape of metal along the side of the RV. I don't know if it was a knife, a piece of wire, or something worse, but he dragged it slowly, deliberately, making sure I knew he was still there, waiting. I gripped my phone, fingers shaking as I tried to dial 911, but there was no signal out here, nothing. Hours passed like that. Every now and then he'd make another sound, tapping on the window, scraping along the wall, or whispering something I couldn't quite make out. Just loud enough to keep me alert, just quiet enough to keep me guessing. Then, as dawn started to break, I finally worked up the courage to peek outside. He was gone, or at least I thought he was. The campsite was dead quiet, like he'd never been there at all. But the ground around my RV was littered with sticks, broken branches, and strange little symbols carved into the dirt right by my door. He'd left a note, scrawled on a scrap of bark, a final parting gift. The note was simple. Not everything that goes into the woods comes back out. Remember that. I didn't waste any more time. I threw everything I could grab into the RV, fired up the engine, and got out of there without looking back. My name is Daniel Richards, and in 1998 I was on a solo trip through the Ozarks, armed with nothing more than a stubborn streak and an RV I'd bought with half my savings. I thought I'd find peace, maybe some space to decompress. I didn't expect that by nightfall I'd be barricaded inside, wondering if this guy I had just met might actually kill me. It started simple. I was halfway between St. Louis and nowhere, camping just off a little-known gravel road by a creek that the locals said ran dry every summer. It was a quiet spot, no one around except for a couple of distant hikers. But I'd found a decent clearing for the RV and settled in. The evening started out nice enough. I made some coffee and had a lukewarm hot dog off the portable grill. No complaints. That's when I heard the footsteps. Now, I'm used to hearing animals around here, especially in these parts, but this was heavy, slow, and calculated, the sound of someone who didn't need to rush. I figured it was a hunter, maybe a camper who had gotten turned around. A quick glance out the window, though, and I spotted a figure just standing at the edge of the clearing. "Hey there, need help?" I called out, more out of politeness than anything. The guy didn't respond, but he started walking toward me, all calm-like. And when he finally got close enough, I could see he was younger than I expected, maybe early 20s, scruffy beard, hollowed-out cheeks, and a sort of distant look that put me on edge. I asked him again, "You lost or something?" He finally nodded, but it didn't feel right. His face was expressionless, like he was concentrating on something other than the conversation. When he spoke, his voice came out low and dry, like he hadn't used it in a while. "Just passing through," he said. Well, passing through meant getting off my property, but I didn't say that out loud. Instead, I offered him some water and a seat by the fire. Maybe I was being too nice, but when you're out in the woods, you can't just turn your back on folks. He sat, barely touched the water, and kept looking around, especially at the RV, like he was casing the place. I tried some small talk, asked him about his day, his plans, and he gave me one-word answers, barely enough to piece together any kind of story. Eventually I asked him outright, "So what brings you this far out?" He paused for a long moment. "Hunting," he finally said, though he didn't have any gear on him. No rifle, no bow, just his worn-out clothes and a stained backpack he'd placed at his feet. I looked over at his pack, and that's when I noticed something odd. There was a dark patch along the bottom that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Now, I'm not the paranoid type, but that raised some red flags. I kept the conversation light, though, cracking a joke about my own lousy aim if I ever tried hunting. He didn't laugh, just stared at the fire like he was miles away. I wanted him gone. The longer he sat there, the more I felt like I was being slowly cornered. Just as I was about to suggest he head on his way, he suddenly stood up, unzipping his pack. I tensed up, thinking he might pull out a weapon. Instead, he pulled out an old, crumpled map, the kind you'd see in a ranger station, and handed it to me. "Seen this place?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked at the map. It was old, covered in strange handwritten markings that made no sense. "Can't say I have," I replied, trying to hand it back. His face hardened. "You're lying. You've been here before." Now, I had no idea what he was talking about. I hadn't been anywhere near those parts of the Ozarks, but he just kept staring at me, waiting. The way he looked at me, like I was part of some game he was playing, made my skin crawl. I tried to brush it off, said I must have looked like someone else, but he didn't buy it. He was convinced somehow that I knew exactly where this mystery spot was. Finally, he took the map back, tucked it into his pack, and muttered something I couldn't quite hear. Then, without another word, he walked off, disappearing into the trees just as casually as he'd come. I thought that'd be the end of it, just some strange encounter with a drifter. An hour later, I was settling in for the night, windows locked, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that lingered. I heard another noise outside, faint like the sound of branches snapping. I figured it was some animal, but I reached for the flashlight just in case. As soon as the beam hit the trees, I saw him, just standing there watching me, his face hidden in the shadows. He didn't move, didn't say a word, just watched. The flashlight beam flickered, then went out, leaving me in darkness. By the time I got it working again, he was gone. I locked the RV tight after that, bolted every door and window, thinking maybe he'd move on, find some other campsite to haunt. But around midnight, I heard him again. This time, closer, a tapping at the window, slow, rhythmic, like he was testing my patience. I turned off all the lights, hoping he'd take a hint, but the tapping continued, louder each time. Finally, I got up, yanked the curtain open, and nearly jumped out of my skin. He was right there, his face pressed against the glass, grinning. "Let me in," he mouthed, his breath fogging up the window. I shook my head, backed away, and went for my phone, but there was no signal out here. I was stuck alone with no way to call for help. The tapping stopped, but I could hear him moving around the RV, his footsteps crunching against the gravel. Then I heard something else. A metallic scrape, the unmistakable sound of a knife dragging along the side of the RV. I could feel every muscle in my body tense up, my mind racing for a plan. All I had was a half-empty can of pepper spray and a flimsy baseball bat I kept in the back for emergencies. The scraping stopped and everything went silent. I held my breath, listening, waiting for him to make the next move. Minutes passed, then hours, until finally the sky began to lighten. I thought he'd given up, moved on. But as soon as I opened the door to check, he was there, standing just a few feet away, grinning that same eerie grin. In his hand, he held something small and metallic, my RV keys. Before I could react, he lunged, slamming me back against the door. I barely had time to grab the baseball bat, swinging it wildly as he closed in. The first hit barely fazed him, but the second caught him in the shoulder, making him stagger back. I tried to make a run for it, but he was faster. He grabbed me, his grip like iron, dragging me back toward the RV. His face was inches from mine, his breath foul and ragged. "You're not going anywhere," he hissed. In a last-ditch effort, I sprayed the pepper spray right in his face. He screamed, letting go long enough for me to break free. I stumbled back into the RV, slamming the door behind me, but he was relentless, pounding on the windows, trying to break them with his fists. Desperation kicked in. I started the engine, praying it would hold long enough to get me out of there. The RV roared to life, and I floored it, swerving onto the road, with him chasing after me, his face twisted in fury. I didn't stop driving until I hit a ranger station miles down the road. They didn't believe me at first, thought I was some lunatic raving about a drifter, but they sent someone back to check my campsite, just in case. Turns out, they found more than just the damage to my RV. They found a makeshift camp hidden in the woods nearby, littered with bones, broken tools, and a journal filled with disturbing sketches and cryptic messages. One page was marked with a crude map that matched the one he'd shown me, with the words "New Friend" scrawled next to it. When they asked if I wanted to press charges, I just shook my head. I didn't need any more reminders of that night. My name is Joshua Lucas, and back in 2016, I decided to take my RV up to Lake Louise in Bee National Park, thinking it was about time I embraced the great outdoors. I'm not exactly what you'd call a nature enthusiast. My idea of roughing it usually involves slow Wi-Fi. But after hitting 35 and realizing my most adventurous experience was trying sushi for the first time, I figured a change of pace wouldn't hurt. Armed with a freshly bought camping guide and an optimism that can only come from ignorance, I set out on a Friday morning. The drive was picturesque, with mountains towering on either side like silent guardians. I couldn't help but think I'd been missing out all these years, cooped up in my apartment with nothing but takeout menus and streaming services. When I finally arrived at the campsite, a friendly park ranger named Lucas greeted me. He looked every bit the outdoorsman, tall, rugged, and with a beard that probably had its own zip code. "First time here?" he asked, noticing my city slicker attire. "Is it that obvious?" I replied, glancing down at my spotless hiking boots. They were so new they squeaked. "Just a hunch," he said with a grin. "Let me know if you need anything and watch out for the wildlife. They can be unpredictable." "I'll keep an eye out, or maybe two," I joked. I parked my RV in a secluded spot near the edge of the lake. The water was so clear it mirrored the sky, and I thought maybe nature wasn't so bad after all. Setting up camp was easier than expected, mostly because the RV did all the work. I unfolded a lawn chair, cracked open a beer, and settled in to enjoy the view. As the sun began to set, I attempted to cook over an open fire. Let's just say if there were an award for most charred hot dog, I'd be a strong contender. Still, there was something satisfying about eating under the stars, even if the food was borderline inedible. That's when I noticed a figure across the lake near the tree line. At first, it looked like another camper, but something about the way they stood there, motionless, was unsettling. I squinted, but before I could make out any details, they slipped into the woods. "Probably just another nature enthusiast communing with the trees," I muttered, taking another sip of my beer. Later that night, as I was getting ready to turn in, I heard a rustling noise outside. I thought it might be a raccoon attracted by the smell of burnt hot dogs. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped out of the RV. "Who's there?" I called out, feeling a bit foolish. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. Just as I was about to head back inside, I saw a glint of something near the base of a tree. Curiosity piqued. I walked over and found a small silver locket lying in the grass. It looked old, tarnished with age. I opened it to find a faded photograph of a young woman. How did this end up here? Deciding it was too late to ponder mysteries, I pocketed the locket and went back inside. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the RV seemed amplified in the silence. I told myself it was just the unfamiliar surroundings. Eventually, exhaustion took over. The next morning, I woke to the sound of knocking. I opened the door to find Lucas standing there, a serious look on his face. "Morning," he said. "We're conducting a search. A camper has been reported missing. Have you seen or heard anything unusual?" I hesitated, thinking about the figure I'd seen and the locket. "Actually, I found this last night," I said, handing him the locket. He examined it closely. "This belongs to Emily Sanders," he said quietly. "She was reported missing 2 days ago." A chill settled in my gut. "I thought I saw someone near the woods yesterday," I added. Lucas nodded. "If you see or hear anything else, let us know immediately." He left to continue the search, leaving me with a sense of unease. I decided to distract myself by heading into town to stock up on supplies. The general store was quaint, the kind of place that sold everything from fishing bait to novelty postcards. An elderly man behind the counter greeted me with a nod. "You must be new around here," he said, eyeing me over his spectacles. "Is it that obvious?" I replied, picking up a can of bug spray. "The mosquitoes seem to think I'm a 5-star buffet," he chuckled. "City folk always taste sweeter, I suppose." "Guess I should have worn cologne made of garlic," I joked as I paid for my items. I considered mentioning the missing camper but decided against it. Maybe it was the way his eyes clouded over at the mention of the lake. Back at the campsite, I decided to go for a paddle on the lake. I rented a kayak, thinking a little exercise might clear my head. As I glided across the water, the serenity was palpable until I noticed something floating near the shoreline. Curiosity got the better of me, and I paddled closer. It was a backpack, half submerged. Pulling it into the kayak, I unzipped it to find clothes and a wallet. The ID belonged to a man named Daniel Lee, another missing camper. My stomach tightened. Just then I heard the distant sound of a motorboat. Looking up, I saw a small boat heading in my direction. A man stood at the helm, waving. "Found something, did you?" he shouted over the engine's roar. "Yeah," I replied. "Looks like someone lost their backpack." He pulled up alongside me. "Let's have a look." I handed it over, and his eyes flickered with recognition. "Well, I'll be," he said. "Daniel's always losing things." "You know him?" I asked. "Oh, everyone knows everyone around here," he said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "I can return it to him if you'd like," he offered. Something about him made me uneasy. "That's okay," I said, forcing a smile. "I'll give it to the park rangers." His expression hardened for a split second before returning to a friendly facade. "Suit yourself," he said, revving the engine. "Be careful out here. The lake can be unpredictable." With that, he sped off, leaving me bobbing in his wake. I returned ashore, my mind racing. Who was that man, and why did he seem so eager to take the backpack? I headed straight to the ranger station and handed over the backpack to a woman named Karen. She thanked me and assured me they'd look into it. Feeling restless, I wandered over to a bulletin board displaying missing person notices. Daniel Lee's face stared back at me, along with Emily Sanders and several others. How had so many people gone missing without making the news? I approached Karen again. "There seem to be a lot of missing people around here," I said. She sighed. "It's been a tough year. Folks come out here unprepared, underestimate the wilderness." "Is that all it is?" I asked. She looked at me thoughtfully. "You should enjoy your vacation. Leave the worrying to us." Unsatisfied, I left the station. That evening, I visited the local bar, the Moose's Head, hoping to glean some information. The place was a mix of tourists and locals. I took a seat at the bar next to a man nursing a beer. "Rough day?" I asked. He glanced at me. "You could say that." "Tell me about it." "I came here for some peace and quiet, and now I'm in the middle of a missing persons mystery." He raised an eyebrow. "You talking about the campers?" I nodded. "Seems like no one wants to talk about it." He took a sip of his beer. "People around here are superstitious. They think the woods are haunted." I smirked. "Do you believe that?" He shook his head. "No, but I do believe there's something out there." "Like what?" He leaned in. "There's talk of a man who lives deep in the forest. Some say he's a former military type who went off the grid." "You mean Victor?" I asked, recalling the name. The man stiffened. "You've met him?" "Briefly. He gave me the creeps. Stay away from him," he warned. "He's dangerous." Before I could ask more, he got up and left. Back at the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I double-checked the locks on the RV and kept a flashlight within reach. Sleep was fitful, filled with fragmented dreams. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, but when I looked, there was nothing. The next morning, I'd had enough. I began packing up, ready to cut my trip short. As I was throwing away the last of my gear, I noticed a piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper. Unfolding it, I read, "Leave while you still can." My heart raced. Was this a threat or a warning? I headed to the ranger station but found it deserted. Frustrated, I decided to find Lucas. Driving along the main road, I spotted his truck parked near a trailhead. I followed the path, calling out his name. After about 20 minutes, I stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood a cabin, old and weather-beaten. Against my better judgment, I approached. The door was ajar. Inside, the place was a mess, papers strewn about, maps pinned to the walls. Then I saw it, a wall covered in photographs, images of the missing campers, all marked with red X's. My own photo was among them, circled in red. A floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around to see Victor standing there, a twisted smile on his face. "You just couldn't leave well enough alone, could you?" he said. "What is this?" I demanded, gesturing to the wall. "An unnecessary collection," he replied, "to cleanse the area of intruders." "You're hurting innocent people," he shrugged. "Sacrifices must be made to protect the land." I edged toward the door, but he blocked my path. "I'm afraid I can't let you leave," he said, pulling out a hunting knife. Desperate, I grabbed a chair and threw it at him. It caught him off guard, giving me a split second to dart past. I sprinted into the woods, adrenaline fueling my escape. Branches whipped against my face, roots threatened to trip me. I could hear Victor crashing through the underbrush behind me. Suddenly, I broke into a clearing and collided with someone. It was Lucas. "Help!" I gasped. "Victor, he's after me." Lucas's eyes widened. "This way." He led me to a hidden path that wound back toward the lake. "We need to get to the station," he said. Behind us, Victor's voice echoed, "You can't hide." We reached the lake and jumped into a motorboat tied to the dock. Lucas fired up the engine, and we sped across the water. Halfway across, the engine sputtered and died. "You've got to be kidding me," I groaned. Lucas frantically tried to restart it. On the shore, Victor appeared, aiming a rifle. "Get down!" Lucas shouted. A shot rang out, hitting the side of the boat. I grabbed a paddle and began rowing with all my might. Lucas joined me, and together we made it to the opposite shore. We scrambled up the bank and ran toward the main road. A patrol car was passing by, and we flagged it down. Inside were two officers who listened as we recounted everything. They called for backup and headed back to apprehend Victor. Hours later, we received word that Victor had been caught. After a brief standoff, he was taken into custody, muttering about protecting the land from invaders. An investigation revealed that Victor was a former park ranger who had lost his job due to budget cuts. He'd become obsessed with preserving the wilderness by any means necessary. Turns out the real danger wasn't the wild animals, but a man who couldn't let go of the past. My name is Jeffrey Timothy, and back in 2016, I found myself in the heart of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I'd always fancied myself an outdoor enthusiast, though my friends joked that my idea of roughing it was staying at a 3-star hotel without room service. I decided it was high time to prove them wrong, so armed with a tent I'd never unfolded and a map I could barely read, I set out to conquer the Appalachian Trail. Well, at least a modest section of it. What's the worst that could happen? I thought. After all, people less competent than me had managed just fine, or so I hoped. On the first day, the sun was shining, birds were chirping, and I was patting myself on the back for embracing nature's grandeur. I even managed to set up my tent without it collapsing on me, which I considered a small miracle. That night, as I sat by the campfire attempting to cook beans straight from the can, I felt a sense of accomplishment. Who needed gourmet meals when you had the stars as your ceiling? The next morning, I met a fellow hiker named La. She was everything I wasn't, experienced, prepared, and unfazed by the wilderness. "First time out here?" she asked, eyeing my lopsided backpack. "Is it that obvious?" I chuckled. She grinned. "Just a hunch. Stick with me. I can show you some spots that aren't on the map." We spent the day trekking through trails that seemed untouched by anyone else. La had a knack for storytelling, regaling me with local legends and myths. One tale stood out, a story about a creature that supposedly roamed these mountains. "They say it's like a massive wolverine, but smarter, almost cunning," she said, her eyes gleaming with mischief. "Sounds like my ex," I joked. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we set up camp near a clear, babbling brook. La insisted on making a proper fire, and soon the aroma of her homemade stew filled the air. "This sure beats canned beans," I admitted. "Stick with me and you'll be a pro in no time," she winked. That night, the tranquility was shattered by distant howls. "Wolves?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Wolves haven't been in these parts for decades," La replied, her brow furrowing. "Maybe it's a coyote with delusions of grandeur," I quipped, but deep down, unease settled in my stomach. The howls didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. They were deeper, resonating, almost like a guttural echo reverberating through the trees. We decided to turn in, chalking it up to the wild playing tricks on our city-dweller senses. Sleep came fitfully. I dreamt of shadowy figures darting between trees, always just out of sight. The next morning, we found tracks near our campsite, massive footprints with elongated claw marks. "I don't recall Bigfoot being a local resident," I said, half joking. La didn't laugh. "We should keep moving," she suggested. As we packed up, I noticed that some of our food supplies were missing. "I could have sworn I had a whole loaf of bread," I mumbled. "Probably a raccoon," La said, but her tone lacked conviction. We pressed on, but the forest seemed to grow denser, the canopy above blocking out more sunlight than before. The air felt heavy, laden with the scent of damp earth and something else, something musky and unfamiliar. Around midday, we stumbled upon an old cabin, seemingly abandoned. "Didn't think there'd be property listings out here," I remarked. "Let's check it out," La said, already making her way toward it. Inside, the cabin was a relic of the past. Dust-covered furniture, a hearth with charred wood, and walls adorned with yellowed newspaper clippings. One headline caught my eye. "Mysterious disappearances plague the Smokies." "Comforting," I muttered. La found a journal on a rickety table. The entries were cryptic, detailing sightings of a creature that walks like a man but hunts like a beast. "Maybe we shouldn't be here," I suggested. She nodded. "Agreed. Let's keep moving." As we left the cabin, the forest seemed even quieter than before, as if holding its breath. The silence was broken by a snapping twig. We both froze. "Probably just another hiker," I whispered. "With feet that big?" La pointed to fresh tracks leading away from the cabin, matching the ones we'd seen earlier. We decided to pick up the pace. "You know, maybe speed hiking will be the next big fitness trend," I joked, trying to lighten the mood. The daylight began to wane, and setting up camp was less about comfort and more about necessity. We built a fire larger than the last, hoping it would act as a deterrent to whatever was out there. "Ever wish you were back in your cozy apartment?" La asked. "Right now I'd trade all the stars in the sky for a flickering fluorescent light and the sound of traffic," I admitted. The night was restless. Every rustle, every distant sound had my nerves on edge. Around midnight a scream pierced the silence, not human, not animal, but something in between. La grabbed her flashlight. "Stay here," she instructed. "Like hell I will," I protested, grabbing a sturdy branch as a makeshift weapon. We cautiously moved toward the sound. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, landing on a gruesome sight. A deer carcass, torn apart as if by enormous claws. "Whatever did this is close," La whispered. "Close and in dire need of a vegetarian diet," I added, my attempted humor falling flat. A low rumbling noise emanated from the shadows. We spun around, the flashlight catching a glimpse of something retreating behind the trees. "Did you see that?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Keep your voice down," she hissed. We backed away slowly, returning to our campsite. "We can't stay here," I said. "Agreed. We need to head back to the main trail," La replied. We hastily packed our gear, the feeling of being watched intensifying as we started moving. The forest seemed to come alive with sounds, branches snapping, leaves rustling, footsteps pacing us. "Ever feel like you're the punchline in a bad horror movie?" I whispered. "Less talking, more walking," she retorted. Suddenly, a figure leapt out from the bushes, knocking me to the ground. It was massive, standing on two legs like a human but covered in matted fur. Its face resembled that of a grizzly bear, but with sharper features and eyes that seemed almost intelligent. "Jeffrey!" La screamed, swinging her backpack at the creature. I scrambled to my feet as the beast turned its attention to her. Without thinking, I grabbed a rock and hurled it at its head. "Hey, ugly! Over here!" The rock struck its shoulder, barely causing a flinch, but enough to divert its gaze back to me. "Great plan, Jeffrey," I muttered to myself. The creature charged. I dodged behind a tree, narrowly avoiding a swipe from its claws that left deep gashes in the bark. "I didn't sign up for this," I shouted. La dug frantically through her backpack. "Keep it busy," she yelled. "Sure, let me just set up a tea party," I retorted, ducking another swing. She pulled out a flare gun. "Get down!" I dropped as she fired. The flare hit the creature square in the chest, igniting its fur. It let out a horrifying roar, thrashing wildly before darting back into the darkness. "Where did you get a flare gun?" I asked, panting. "Never leave home without it," she smirked, but her eyes betrayed her inner fear. "We need to move now." We sprinted through the forest, branches whipping our faces, the terrain uneven beneath our feet. Behind us, the creature's pained howls echoed, a grim reminder that it was wounded but not defeated. "There's a ranger station a few miles east," La shouted between breaths. lead the way. We pushed on, adrenaline fueling our escape. The forest began to thin, and for a moment, hope sparked. That was until we stumbled upon another gruesome scene. A campsite ravaged, tents shredded, and no sign of the occupants except for scattered belongings. "This just keeps getting better," I said, nausea rising. La picked up a discarded map. "We're close." A blood-curdling howl pierced the air. Closer this time. "I think Fluffy's back," I quipped. "Less joking, more running," she retorted. We tore through the remaining stretch of forest, the silhouette of the ranger station appearing at the top of a small hill. "Almost there," La encouraged. A sudden weight slammed into me from behind, knocking me flat. The creature had caught up, its fiery eyes glaring down, its breath hot and foul against my face. "Get off him!" La screamed, unloading another flare. This time, the creature anticipated it, swatting it away effortlessly. "Any more tricks up your sleeve?" I gasped, struggling beneath the beast's weight. She glanced around desperately. "The shed!" With a burst of strength fueled by sheer panic, I wriggled free as the creature was momentarily distracted. We bolted toward a small shed beside the ranger station. Inside, we barricaded the door with whatever we could find. Tools, a workbench, anything to buy us time. "Now what?" I panted. She grabbed a hunting rifle mounted on the wall. "Found something. Can you use that?" "Guess we'll find out." The door shook violently as the creature battered against it. Wood splintered, hinges groaned. La aimed at the door, her hands steady. "On 3. 1, I began. 2, she continued. Before we could say 3, the door burst open. The creature lunged and La fired. The shot echoed and the beast recoiled, a dark stain spreading across its torso. It stumbled back, letting out a guttural noise somewhere between a snarl and a scream. Without wasting a second, La fired again. This time, the creature collapsed, its massive form crashing to the ground. We stood there, breaths ragged, hearts pounding. "Is it dead?" I asked. She approached cautiously, prodding it with the rifle's barrel. "Seems like it." Relief washed over me. "Well, that was a walk in the park," I joked weakly. "Your idea of a park needs some work," she replied, managing a small smile. We alerted the authorities from the ranger station radio. When they arrived, their faces paled at the sight of the creature. Questions flew at us, but we had few answers. In the days that followed, news of the beast of the Smokies spread like wildfire. Speculations ranged from genetic experiments to undiscovered species. Unable to shake my curiosity, I did some digging. Old archives, forgotten records, and whispered legends pointed to a reclusive scientist who'd lived in the area decades ago. Dr. Harold Whitaker had been obsessed with hybridization, merging human and animal DNA. His experiments were deemed unethical, and he vanished without a trace. It seemed his legacy hadn't vanished with him. My name is Jonathan Warren, and this all went down on September 15th, 2003. I had just turned 36, and I wanted to celebrate my birthday a little differently. Instead of hitting up the usual bars in town, I decided to take my newly acquired RV on its first real trip. I was living in Marquette, Michigan, a small city on the shores of Lake Superior, known for its natural beauty and endless outdoor activities. It was the perfect place to start an adventure. I invited my buddy, Jacob Nolan, to join me. We'd known each other since college, and he was always up for anything. We packed our gear, stocked the RV with food and beer, and headed out to the Hiawatha National Forest. It's a lesser-known spot compared to other touristy places, but it's got these secluded areas that are perfect for camping. We arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon. It was peaceful, no other campers in sight, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirping of birds. We set up our camp, lit a fire, and started grilling some burgers. The smell of the meat cooking combined with the fresh forest air was intoxicating. We cracked open a couple of beers and settled into our chairs, reminiscing about old times. "Remember that time we went to that party at Mallister's, and you ended up in the neighbor's pool?" Jacob laughed, taking a swig of his beer. "Yeah, man, that was wild. I still can't believe we didn't get arrested." I replied, chuckling. As the night wore on, the fire died down and we decided to call it a night. We retreated into the RV, where it was warm and cozy. I remember thinking how great it felt to be away from everything, disconnected from the world. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise outside. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. It sounded almost like something scratching at the RV. At first, I thought it might be a raccoon or some other small animal, but the noise was too deliberate. I nudged Jacob awake. "Hey, you hear that?" I whispered. He groaned, rubbing his eyes. "Yeah, probably just a raccoon or something. Go back to sleep." But the noise didn't stop. It grew louder and more insistent. I decided to check it out. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly opened the door, stepping into the chilly night. The forest was eerily silent, except for the sound of my own breathing. I scanned the area with the flashlight, but didn't see anything unusual. Just as I was about to head back inside, I noticed something near the edge of our campsite, a dark shape moving slowly between the trees. "Jacob, come out here," I called, keeping my voice low. He stumbled out of the RV, still half asleep. "What is it?" "Look," I said, pointing towards the trees. The figure stopped moving. It stood there just beyond the reach of the flashlight's beam. We couldn't make out any details, but it was tall and oddly shaped, like it was hunched over. "Who's there?" Jacob called out, his voice a mix of curiosity and irritation. There was no response, just the rustling of leaves. Suddenly the figure bolted, disappearing into the forest. We looked at each other, bewildered. "What the hell was that?" Jacob asked. "I have no idea," I replied, "but I'm not going back to sleep until we figure it out." We decided to stay up and keep watch. We sat by the dying embers of the fire, listening intently for any other sounds. Hours passed, and just as we started to relax, the scratching noise returned. This time it was coming from the back of the RV. We jumped up and rushed to the rear, but again there was nothing there. Frustrated and on edge, we decided to search the area around the RV, armed with flashlights and a couple of kitchen knives for good measure. We ventured into the forest and didn't get far before we stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. There, half buried in the underbrush, was a freshly dug hole, and next to it a shovel covered in dirt. It didn't look like an animal had done this. It was too precise, too deliberate. "Jonathan, this is messed up. We need to get out of here," Jacob said, his voice shaky. "I agree. Let's pack up and leave," I replied, my heart pounding. We hurried back to the RV, but as we approached, we saw something that stopped us in our tracks. There were deep, claw-like marks running down the side of the RV. Whatever had made those marks had some serious strength. "Okay, screw this. We're leaving now," Jacob said, rushing to unlock the door. We jumped inside and fired up the engine. As we sped away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure chasing after us. But there was nothing, just a dark, empty road behind us. We didn't stop until we reached a small town about 20 miles away. We found a diner that was open 24 hours and decided to grab some coffee and figure out what to do next. As we sat in the booth, the reality of what had happened started to sink in. "What do you think that was?" Jacob asked, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug. "I don't know, man. It wasn't human, that's for sure. But I've never heard of any animal that could do something like that," I replied. We spent the rest of the night talking and trying to make sense of it all, but no matter how we looked at it, it didn't add up. Eventually, we decided to head back to Marquette and report what had happened to the authorities. Maybe they'd have some answers. The next day, we went to the local police station and told them everything. The officer who took our statement looked skeptical, but he promised to send someone to check out the campsite. We never heard back from them, though. It was like our story had just been filed away and forgotten. A few days later, I got a call from Jacob. He sounded shaken. "Jonathan, you need to see this," he said. "Turn on the news." I switched on the TV, and there it was, a report about a missing hiker found dead in the Hiawatha National Forest. The details were gruesome. The body had been discovered near a campsite, and the cause of death was unclear. But what stood out to me was the mention of deep, claw-like marks on the victim's body. I felt the chill run down my spine. "Jacob, that could have been us," I said. "I know," he replied. "We need to find out what's going on. We can't just let this go." We spent the next few weeks doing research, digging into local folklore and old newspaper articles. We found references to a creature that the local Native American tribes had spoken of, a beast that roamed the forests, hunting those who ventured too far into its territory. They called it Gnarl. The more we read, the more convinced we became that Gnarl was real. But there were no concrete sightings, no definitive proof, just stories and legends passed down through generations. One night, Jacob and I were at my place, poring over maps and documents, when we heard a knock at the door. I opened it to find a middle-aged man with a weathered face standing on my porch. "Are you Jonathan Warren?" he asked. "Yeah, that's me. Who are you?" I replied. "My name's Daniel. I heard about what happened to you guys in the forest. I've seen Gnarl too," he said, his voice steady. We invited him in, eager to hear what he had to say. Daniel told us about his own encounter with Gnarl years ago. He had been hunting with his brother when they came across the creature. It had killed his brother, and Daniel had barely escaped with his life. "I've been trying to track it ever since," he said, "but it's elusive. It doesn't leave much behind." We shared our story with him, and he nodded, understanding our fear and frustration. "I believe you," he said, "and I think we can find it together." The three of us formed an unlikely alliance, determined to uncover the truth. We made plans to return to the forest, this time better prepared. We brought cameras, recording equipment and weapons, just in case. We camped in the same spot where Jacob and I had our encounter, setting up a perimeter and keeping watch throughout the night. The forest was unnervingly quiet, and we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Around midnight, we heard the familiar scratching noise again. We grabbed our gear and moved toward the sound, hearts pounding. Just beyond the trees, we saw it, Gnarl, its hulking form barely visible in the moonlight. We tried to capture footage, but the creature moved too quickly, darting through the forest with unnatural speed. We chased it for what felt like hours, but it always stayed one step ahead. Eventually, we lost sight of it, and exhausted, we returned to the campsite. "We need a new plan," Daniel said, frustration evident in his voice. "It's too fast. We need to lure it in." Over the next few days, we devised a trap. We set up bait and positioned ourselves strategically around the campsite. As night fell, we waited in intense silence, hoping our plan would work. Sure enough, just past midnight, we heard the scratching again. This time we stayed put, waiting for Gnarl to take the bait. It emerged from the shadows, cautiously approaching the bait we had laid out. I held my breath, watching as the creature came closer. It was bigger than I remembered, its eyes glinting in the darkness. Just as it reached the bait, we sprang into action, shining bright lights on it and attempting to capture it on camera. Gnarl let out a guttural snarl and lunged at us, moving with terrifying speed. We barely managed to dodge its attack, and in the chaos, Jacob was knocked to the ground. The creature loomed over him, its claws poised to strike. Without thinking, I grabbed a nearby branch and swung it at Gnarl, hitting it with all my strength. It snarled and turned on me, its eyes filled with rage. I braced myself for the attack, but Daniel fired a shot, hitting the creature in the shoulder. Gnarl roared in pain and retreated into the forest, disappearing into the darkness. We helped Jacob to his feet, relieved that we had survived the encounter. We packed up and left the forest, knowing we had come too close to death. We didn't get the definitive proof we were looking for, but we had enough footage and evidence to know that Gnarl was real. Back in Marquette, we shared our story with the local authorities and media. Some people believed us, while others dismissed our claims as a hoax. But we knew the truth, and we warned everyone to stay away from that part of the forest. Jacob and I went back to our regular lives, forever changed by our experience. We stayed in touch with Daniel, who continued his quest to track and study Gnarl. We knew we had been lucky to survive, and we didn't want to push our luck any further. Years passed, and the memory of that night slowly faded, but I could never forget the feeling of being hunted, the fear that gnawed at me. And every time I heard a scratching noise in the dead of night, I couldn't help but wonder if Gnarl was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next prey. And that's the story, man. It's been years since then, but every now and then, I still think about it. I still dream about it. You know, it's like something out of a nightmare, but it happened. It's real. So, if you ever decide to go camping in the Hiawatha National Forest, be careful. You never know what's out there. My name is George Richards, and this all happened back in 1983 near Kenai Peninsula, Alaska. Growing up as part of the Dena'ina Athabascan tribe, I've always loved the wilderness, but I wouldn't call myself a mountain man or anything. This time, though, I was out there alone. No fancy camping setup, just a week to myself and a worn tent after getting through a rough breakup and work stress piling up. The quiet seemed perfect. The locals I met along the way were skeptical when they heard I'd be camping out alone, warning me that Alaska was no place to take lightly, especially near Kenai, where bears and wolves were common. I laughed it off with a quick joke about X's being scarier than wildlife, but their faces remained blank, serious. As I left the last tiny general store, the clerk muttered something under his breath that I barely caught. It sounded like he said, "Hope you come back." Maybe it was my imagination. The first few days were uneventful. I set up my camp close to the Kenai River, near the tree line where the forest thickened up, far from any official hiking trails. Each morning I'd fish for salmon, clean my catch, and enjoy the absolute silence. The air smelled sharp and clean, mixed with the chill of early autumn, the kind of cold that wakes up your senses. It wasn't until the third night that I felt something odd. There was this sound, like a low snuffling, almost like a bear, but not quite. My first thought was that some animal was sniffing around the camp looking for food. I scanned around with my flashlight, catching nothing but shadows. I'd had enough run-ins with bears in my time to know that this wasn't one. The sound was too close, rhythmic, like an intentional, methodical inspection of the area. Bears aren't exactly subtle, but this thing knew how to be quiet. In the morning, I checked the area around my camp. No paw prints, no torn food bags, just one thing that made no sense. A small pile of bones, clean and neatly stacked right where I'd left my backpack the night before. They were tiny, almost brittle, like from a small bird or a rodent. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was some natural predator's leftovers. Another night passed quietly, and I was almost convinced I'd imagined the sound. On the fifth night, though, it started again. Louder, closer. The snuffling turned to scraping, something clawing at the ground just a few yards from my tent. I sat up, my heart beating in sync with each scratch against the earth. I gripped the knife I kept beside me, hardly a weapon, but better than nothing. I forced myself to stay still, barely breathing. The scraping stopped, and I heard a low dragging sound that seemed to circle around my tent, never quite touching it. Then it stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. Minutes ticked by, stretching until dawn finally brought light. I emerged to find the ground around my tent disturbed, claw marks deep in the earth, like a huge animal had been circling me all night. And there on top of my tent was a feather, pitch black as if it had been dipped in ink. I tried laughing it off. Maybe it was some local prank or a way to scare away city folks, but the weight in my chest said otherwise. That day, I moved camp further up the river, away from the tree line into a more open area. I figured the creature, whatever it was, would feel less inclined to approach with less cover. The feeling of being stalked stuck with me. The forest was quiet, but not in the usual way. No birds, no small animal rustlings, just silence as if the whole place was holding its breath. That night, sleep evaded me. Every slight sound had my ears straining. Then, just as I was dozing off, I heard it, the dragging sound again, slower this time. closer. I sat up, my knife ready in one hand, but then, out of the blue, there was a snap, loud enough to make me jump. I peeked out of the tent to see a massive shape, a form half-shadowed, tall with hunched shoulders and arms too long, like a distorted version of a bear, but wrong. Its arms dragged across the ground, claws scratching the dirt with every movement. And then I saw it turn. Its face was like a fox, elongated, too thin but warped. Its mouth stretched wider than any animal should. Its limbs moved unnaturally, dragging, almost reluctantly. I ducked back into the tent, my heart hammering. It was no animal I'd ever seen, not even close. Part of me wanted to get up and run, but every survival instinct screamed at me to stay put. Hours passed, each one longer than the last. I stayed still until the first hint of dawn, when I finally dared to move. The creature was gone, but my camp was torn up. I found paw prints, if you could even call them that, all around, and another feather, half crushed into the dirt. On the 6th day, the plan was simple. Hike back as fast as I could, back toward the tiny town where I'd last seen people. The weight of the wilderness seemed to press in on me with each step. I expected to hear that dragging sound, see those twisted limbs behind me. By midday, my shoulders burned from the weight of my pack, and I stopped to catch my breath. That's when I noticed I wasn't alone. There was a figure off to the side, hidden partially by the trees. A man, at least that's what I thought. I yelled out, asking if he was lost or needed help. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised a hand and pointed, not at me, but back the way I had come. His face was shadowed, the skin pale like he hadn't seen the sun in years, eyes hollow as if emptied of everything human. My instincts kicked in, and I decided to go the opposite direction of where he pointed. Night came quickly as I pushed forward. I was tired, too tired to keep moving, but the sense of being herded kept me going. It felt like there was more than one of them now, these strange figures watching, waiting, blending into the landscape. I'd see one and then lose it, the figure vanishing into the trees, only to reappear here, a few yards ahead, pointing me in another direction. They were leading me somewhere. I realized somewhere I did not want to go, but the terrain became treacherous as I tried to leave. A stumble, a fall, and my ankle twisted painfully under me. The pain was sharp, blinding, and I knew I was stuck for the night. I limped to a nearby cluster of rocks, hoping they'd offer some cover. Sitting there in the dark, I heard them, the shuffling, the dragging sounds closing in. One by one the figures appeared, standing in a rough circle around me, eyes empty, limbs bent at awkward angles. They moved in sync, slow and methodical. In the dim light of my flashlight, I caught glimpses of their faces, each different, yet somehow alike, as if they'd all been twisted by the same force. The tall creature, the one from before, emerged from the shadows. It moved toward the figures, each one reaching out to it like they were all bound to this thing. And then it looked at me. I don't know why, but that glance felt like a judgment, a silent understanding passing between us. My mind raced, thinking of any way to escape. Suddenly it lunged toward one of the figures, and with a horrific display of strength, tore it apart, scattering flesh and bones like a warning. The others turned, following its lead. I don't know how, but the sight of that violence gave me the adrenaline I needed. I forced myself up, ignoring the pain, and hobbled as fast as I could through the trees. The next few hours blurred, the sound of ripping, the smell of decay, the steady thud of feet pounding behind me. I pushed on, desperation driving me forward, and then I saw it, the outline of a cabin, barely visible through the trees. I staggered to it, half falling against the door, and forced my way inside, locking it behind me. The silence pressed in once more. I collapsed to the floor, panting, staring at the dark windows. I didn't dare move until the first light crept in through the cracks. By then, the sounds had stopped. I stumbled out of the cabin, following the nearest trail back to the town. Later, I learned the cabin had belonged to a trapper who'd vanished years ago. The locals only spoke of him in hushed tones, saying he was taken by a creature known to stalk those woods, something older than any bear or wolf. They called it the Gatherer. A name passed down from the old stories meant to warn people off. I'll tell you this much. Those figures, whatever they were, had been human once. And the Gatherer had made them into something else entirely. Something bound to its will, lurking for anyone foolish enough to step into its territory. My name is Anna Richards, and this happened to me on May 23rd, 2015. I'm going to tell you about the time I went camping alone in my RV and came back with a story that still makes my hands shake when I talk about it. It was supposed to be a week of solitude, just me on the open road, ending up in a little-known stretch of the White Mountains in New Hampshire. I had recently retired from teaching high school history in Manchester and was looking forward to spending time on my own, away from the noise. The drive up was uneventful. The RV hummed along the highway, and I lost myself in a playlist of classic rock and the scenic views of springtime New England. I planned to camp out in a secluded spot I had found years ago, a little clearing near a lake that hardly showed up on maps. The first day was exactly what I hoped for. I fished, read a bit of Hemingway, and managed to cook a decent meal over the fire. The air was crisp, and the sky at night was a blanket of stars. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, far from the constant buzz of city life. But things changed on the second night. I had turned in early. The darkness was complete outside, except for the dim glow of the campfire embers. Sometime after midnight, I was jerked awake by the sound of scratching. It was subtle, rhythmic, like something clawing gently at the side of the RV. I figured it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon curious about my presence. I shouted, "Scram!" hoping to scare it off, but the scratching paused only for a moment before resuming, this time louder and more insistent. I got out of bed, grabbed my flashlight, and cautiously peeked out the window. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the trees and underbrush. The scratching stopped, and thinking the animal had taken off, I tried to go back to sleep. But just as I was dozing off, a loud thud against the side of the RV jolted me upright. This was no raccoon. The next morning, I inspected the RV and found deep gouges in the metal siding. Unease settled in the pit of my stomach, but I chalked it up to perhaps a deer or some other large animal and decided to spend one more night before cutting my trip short. That day I kept to the RV, reading and occasionally scanning the tree line with binoculars, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary. As dusk approached, I locked up the RV, a precaution that now seemed necessary. I tried to settle in for the night, but every little sound from outside seemed amplified. The breaking point came when I heard footsteps, definite, heavy footsteps, circling the RV. I stayed very still, listening as they moved deliberately and slowly. Then, as suddenly as they began, they stopped. I didn't sleep a wink that night, and at the first light of dawn, I decided to get the hell out of there. I started up the RV, not bothering to make coffee or breakfast, and was about to leave when I thought I saw something move at the edge of the clearing. I grabbed my binoculars and scanned the area. That's when I saw it. It stood on two legs, was covered in thick, matted fur, and its eyes were the worst part. They were too intelligent, too knowing. It just stared at me, and I swear it grinned. I don't know what it was, but the look in its eyes told me I wasn't welcome. I drove non-stop until I reached home, shaken. When I told my story, most people chuckled. A few seemed concerned, but most just shrugged it off as an encounter with a bear or some other wildlife. But it wasn't any animal I knew. Months passed, but the incident stayed with me. I began researching local legends and animal sightings in the area. That's when I stumbled across an old logging myth about a creature they called Stockwood. The descriptions matched perfectly with what I saw. It was said to be a protector of the forest, hostile to those it perceived as threats. I've never gone back to that part of the White Mountains, and I doubt I ever will. What I saw was real, and whatever Stockwood is, it's still out there. And that's fine by me. I've learned that some places you're just not meant to visit twice. My name is Bobby Bryan, and this happened to me in May of 1999. I was hauling a load of refrigerated meat across a desolate stretch of highway in Nevada, bound for a distribution center in Sacramento. It was the kind of route where you could drive for hours without seeing another soul, just miles of scrubland and the occasional tumbleweed rolling across the road. The monotony was enough to make anyone go a bit stir-crazy, but the pay was decent, and I had bills to pay. It was around midnight when I pulled into a rest area off Highway 50, also known as the loneliest road in America. I needed a break, and the eerie quiet of the place seemed like as good a spot as any. There were a few other trucks parked there, engines idling softly in the darkness, their drivers no doubt catching some shut-eye. I climbed down from my cab, stretched my legs, and headed toward the restrooms. The air was cool, and the only sound was the distant hum of a generator somewhere. I noticed a beat-up sedan parked at the far end of the lot, its windows too dark to see inside. I didn't think much of it at the time. Folks in all kinds of vehicles used these rest stops. As I was washing my hands in the grimy restroom, I heard the door creak open behind me. In the mirror, I saw a man enter. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with a thick beard, and wearing a ratty flannel shirt. He didn't make eye contact, just shuffled over to the urinals. Something about him set me on edge, but I shrugged it off, dried my hands, and headed back to my truck. When I got back to my rig, I saw another trucker, a guy named Vince I'd met a few times on the road, standing by his truck smoking a cigarette. Vince was a burly guy with a friendly demeanor, and we chatted for a bit about our routes and the usual trucker gripes. "Hey, Bobby," Vince said, taking a drag from his smoke. "You ever get the feeling like you're being watched out here?" I chuckled. "All the time, man. It's probably just the isolation getting to you." Vince nodded, but didn't look convinced. "Yeah, maybe. Anyway, stay safe out there." We said our goodbyes, and I climbed back into my cab, locking the doors out of habit. I reclined my seat, closed my eyes, and tried to get some rest, but sleep didn't come easy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The image of that bearded guy in the restroom kept popping into my head. A few hours later, I was jolted awake by a loud banging on my driver's side door. My heart leapt into my throat as I grabbed the tire iron I kept under my seat and cautiously peered out the window. It was Vince, and he looked panicked. "Bobby, open up, we got trouble." I unlocked the door, and Vince practically fell inside, gasping for breath. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice tinged with alarm. "It's Randy," Vince said between breaths. "You know the guy driving the blue Kenworth? I found him behind the restrooms. He's dead, man. Someone slit his throat." A cold chill ran through me. Randy was another regular on this route, a quiet guy who kept to himself. I couldn't believe it. "Did you call the cops?" "There's no signal out here," Vince replied, his hands shaking. "We need to get out of here and find a phone." I nodded, started the engine, and pulled out of the rest area, with Vince riding shotgun. We drove in silence, both of us on high alert. After what felt like an eternity, we found a diner with a payphone about 30 miles down the road. I called 911 and reported the murder, giving them the location and details as best I could. The police arrived quickly, given the remote location, and took our statements. They told us to stay put while they investigated, but neither Vince nor I wanted to stick around. We both had a bad feeling about the whole thing. We decided to convoy the rest of the way to Sacramento, figuring there was safety in numbers. As we rolled out, I couldn't help but glance in my mirrors constantly, expecting to see that bearded man following us. The sun was just starting to rise, casting long shadows across the landscape, but it did little to ease my nerves. A few hours later, we pulled into the distribution center in Sacramento, exhausted but relieved to be off the road. We checked in, unloaded our cargo, and headed to a nearby truck stop for some much-needed rest. As we sat in the diner nursing cups of bad coffee, we talked about what had happened. "Do you think it was that guy in the restroom?" Vince asked, his eyes darting around the room as if the killer might appear at any moment. "Maybe." I said, stirring my coffee absent-mindedly. He gave me the creeps, but I didn't get a good look at him. Well, whoever it was, they knew what they were doing, Vince said grimly. Randy never had a chance. The next few days were a blur of police interviews and restless nights. The authorities were tight-lipped about their investigation, but word got around that they had no leads and no suspects. Truckers started to avoid that stretch of Highway 50, and those who had no choice but to drive it did so with a heightened sense of vigilance. I couldn't stop thinking about Randy and that bearded man. Every time I pulled into a rest area or truck stop, I found myself scanning the faces around me, looking for anything out of the ordinary. The sense of camaraderie among us truckers was stronger than ever, but so was the underlying current of fear. A week after the murder, I was back on the road, hauling a load of electronics to Salt Lake City. I had just passed through Ely, Nevada, and was heading into another long stretch of desolate highway when I noticed a familiar beat-up sedan in my rearview mirror. It was the same one I'd seen at the rest area the night Randy was killed. My pulse quickened as I kept an eye on the car. It followed me for miles, never getting too close, but never falling too far behind either. I knew I had to do something, but with no cell signal and no other vehicles in sight, my options were limited. I decided to take the next exit, a barely marked dirt road that led to an old mining town. I figured if the car followed me, at least I'd have confirmation that it was no coincidence. Sure enough, the sedan took the exit right after me. My heart pounded as I navigated the rough road, dust kicking up behind my rig. The road wound through a narrow canyon, and I knew I couldn't keep this up forever. I needed to confront whoever was in that car, but I had to be smart about it. Up ahead, I spotted a wide spot in the road where I could pull over. I parked my truck and climbed out, tire iron in hand, ready for whatever came next. The sedan pulled up about 50 feet behind me and stopped. The driver didn't get out, just sat there with the engine running. I took a deep breath and walked toward the car, my grip tightening on the tire iron. "Hey!" I shouted. "What do you want?" There was no response. The driver's window was rolled up, and I couldn't see inside through the tinted glass. I was about to shout again when the door opened, and the bearded man from the restroom stepped out. He didn't say a word, just started walking toward me with a cold, menacing look in his eyes. I raised the tire iron, ready to defend myself, but before I could react, he lunged at me with a knife. We struggled, and I managed to knock the blade from his hand, but he was strong, and I was quickly losing ground. I swung the tire iron, connecting with his shoulder, but it barely seemed to faze him. In the chaos, I heard the distant sound of an engine approaching. Another truck appeared at the top of the canyon, and I could see it was Vince. He must have decided to take the same route after hearing about my plan to cut through the mining town. Vince's truck barreled down the road, and the bearded man, realizing he was outnumbered, made a run for his sedan. He jumped in and sped off, leaving a trail of dust behind him. Vince pulled up beside me, his face a mix of concern and relief. "You okay, Bobby?" he shouted. I nodded, breathing heavily. "Yeah, thanks to you." That guy, he was the one. We reported the incident to the police, who launched a manhunt for the bearded man. Despite their efforts, he was never caught. The attack left me with a deep scar on my arm, both physical and mental. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there somewhere, watching and waiting. The murder of Randy and the attack on me changed everything. Truckers on that route became more cautious, and the sense of unease lingered long after the events of that night. I eventually moved on to a different route, hoping to leave the fear behind, but the memories stayed with me. Years later, I still think about that night. I wonder who the bearded man was and why he chose us. I never got any answers, and maybe I never will, but one thing's for sure. I'll never forget the loneliest road in America and the terror that came with it. My name is Lucas Warren, and this all went down on September 15th, 2012. You wouldn't think much happens in the middle of nowhere, Missouri, but that's where I found myself that fall. I decided to take a break from my job at the auto shop and get some peace and quiet. I borrowed my buddy Mike's RV and hit the road, aiming to camp near an old lake we'd fished at years ago. The lake wasn't anything special, just a quiet spot surrounded by thick woods. Mike and I had gone there a few times, and it always felt like our own secret place. This time, I wanted to spend a few days fishing, reading, and maybe having a beer or two without any distractions. I got there in the afternoon, parked the RV, and set up camp. The sun was just starting to dip, casting long shadows over the water. It was serene, the kind of place where you could hear yourself think. I started a fire, cracked open a beer, and settled into my old camping chair. Everything was perfect. The first night was uneventful. I slept like a log, waking up to the sound of birds and the smell of pine. I spent the day fishing and caught a couple of decent-sized bass. It was around sunset when I noticed something odd. The woods, usually alive with the sounds of critters and birds, had gone dead silent. It was like someone had hit the mute button. I shrugged it off, figuring maybe a coyote or something was nearby. As it got darker, I stoked the fire and cooked up the fish I'd caught. I was just finishing my meal when I heard a noise, a sort of rustling, like something big was moving through the trees. I strained my ears, trying to catch any sound, but everything went quiet again. Probably just a deer, I muttered to myself, tossing another log on the fire. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to head inside the RV and lock up for the night, just in case. Around midnight, I woke up to a scratching sound on the side of the RV. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder, more insistent. I grabbed the flashlight and my pocket knife, the only weapon I had, and crept toward the window, peeking out. I didn't see anything, but the scratching continued. "Who's out there?" I called, my voice sounding braver than I felt. The scratching stopped abruptly. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing happened. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just a branch or an animal. I climbed back into bed, but sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, I found long, deep scratches on the side of the RV. They were too high to be from any animal I knew of, and definitely not a branch. I decided to stay close to camp that day, keeping the fire going and my eyes open. By afternoon, the uneasy feeling had settled into a constant knot in my stomach. Mike called to check in, and I almost told him about the scratches, but decided against it. He just laughed and told me I was being paranoid. Instead, I talked about the fish and the good weather. As the day wore on, I kept hearing noises from the woods, like something was watching me. I couldn't see anything, but I knew I wasn't alone. That night, I fortified the RV as best as I could, locking all the doors and windows. I kept the flashlight and knife close. Sleep was fitful, and I woke up several times hearing those strange noises. Around 3 a.m., the RV started to shake violently, like something was pushing it from the outside. I jumped up, heart pounding, and flicked on the flashlight. The shaking stopped, but I could hear heavy breathing outside, low and guttural. I yelled, "Get away from here," and the breathing turned into a low, menacing growl. I didn't dare open the door or look out the window. I just sat there, knife in hand, waiting for dawn. When the sun finally came up, the shaking and growling had stopped. I stepped outside, every muscle tense, and saw more scratches on the RV. These ones were deeper, and there were strange footprints around the camp. They were like nothing I'd ever seen, big and clawed, almost like a bear's, but different, more human-like. I decided it was time to leave. I packed up as quickly as I could and started the RV, my hands trembling as I pulled out of the campsite. I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, something large and dark, just slipping back into the woods. I didn't stop to look closer. The drive back to town felt like it took forever. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing me. When I finally got back to civilization, I parked the RV at Mike's place and sat there, trying to make sense of what happened. Mike came out and saw the scratches. "What the hell did you do to my RV?" he asked, half joking but with a worried look in his eyes. "I don't know, man. Something was out there. I can't explain it," I said, my voice shaking. He looked at me like I was crazy, but he didn't press the issue. I went home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't done with me. A few nights later, I had the same dream. I was back at the lake, sitting by the fire, and something was watching me from the trees. The dream felt so real that I'd wake up sweating, the sound of heavy breathing still echoing in my ears. I started doing some research, trying to figure out what it could have been. I read about all sorts of creatures and legends, but nothing matched exactly. The closest thing was a local legend about a creature called the Rock, a sort of forest spirit that was said to guard the woods. The stories were vague, but they all mentioned the same thing: deep scratches and the sense of being watched. I didn't go back to that lake, and I never camped alone again. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to find out. It's been years, and sometimes I still hear that low breathing in my dreams. Maybe it was just my imagination, but those scratches were real, and so was the fear. So that's my story. Believe it or not, it's what happened. Sometimes I think about going back, trying to find out more, but then I remember those nights and the terror that gripped me. Some things are better left alone. And that's it. I don't have all the answers, but I know one thing. I'm not going back to that lake. Not ever. My name is Lucas Warren, and this all went down on September 15th, 2012. You wouldn't think much happens in the middle of nowhere, Missouri, but that's where I found myself that fall. I decided to take a break from my job at the auto shop and get some peace and quiet. I borrowed my buddy Mike's RV and hit the road, aiming to camp near an old lake we'd fished at years ago. The lake wasn't anything special, just a quiet spot surrounded by thick woods. Mike and I had gone there a few times, and it always felt like our own secret place. This time, I wanted to spend a few days fishing, reading, and maybe having a beer or two without any distractions. I got there in the afternoon, parked the RV, and set up camp. The sun was just starting to dip, casting long shadows over the water. It was serene, the kind of place where you could hear yourself think. I started a fire, cracked open a beer, and settled into my old camping chair. Everything was perfect. The first night was uneventful. I slept like a log, waking up to the sound of birds and the smell of pine. I spent the day fishing and caught a couple of decent-sized bass. It was around sunset when I noticed something odd. The woods, usually alive with the sounds of critters and birds, had gone dead silent. It was like someone had hit the mute button. I shrugged it off, figuring maybe a coyote or something was nearby. As it got darker, I stoked the fire and cooked up the fish I'd caught. I was just finishing my meal when I heard a noise, a sort of rustling like something big was moving through the trees. I strained my ears, trying to catch any sound, but everything went quiet again. Probably just a deer, I muttered to myself, tossing another log on the fire. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to head inside the RV and lock up for the night, just in case. Around midnight, I woke up to a scratching sound on the side of the RV. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder, more insistent. I grabbed the flashlight and my pocket knife, the only weapon I had, and crept toward the window, peeking out. I didn't see anything, but the scratching continued. "Who's out there?" I called, my voice sounding braver than I felt. The scratching stopped abruptly. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing happened. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just a branch or an animal. I climbed back into bed, but sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, I found long, deep scratches on the side of the RV. They were too high to be from any animal I knew of, and definitely not a branch. I decided to stay close to camp that day, keeping the fire going and my eyes open. By afternoon, the uneasy feeling had settled into a constant knot in my stomach. Mike called to check in, and I almost told him about the scratches, but decided against it. He just laughed and told me I was being paranoid. Instead, I talked about the fish and the good weather. As the day wore on, I kept hearing noises from the woods, like something was watching me. I couldn't see anything, but I knew I wasn't alone. That night, I fortified the RV as best as I could, locking all the doors and windows. I kept the flashlight and knife close. Sleep was fitful, and I woke up several times hearing those strange noises. Around 3 a.m., the RV started to shake violently, like something was pushing it from the outside. I jumped up, heart pounding, and flicked on the flashlight. The shaking stopped, but I could hear heavy breathing outside, low and guttural. I yelled, "Get away from here!" and the breathing turned into a low, menacing growl. I didn't dare open the door or look out the window. I just sat there, knife in hand, waiting for dawn. When the sun finally came up, the shaking and growling had stopped. I stepped outside, every muscle tense, and saw more scratches on the RV. These ones were deeper, and there were strange footprints around the camp. They were like nothing I'd ever seen, big and clawed, almost like a bear's, but different, more human-like. I decided it was time to leave. I packed up as quickly as I could and started the RV, my hands trembling as I pulled out of the campsite. I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, something large and dark, just slipping back into the woods. I didn't stop to look closer. The drive back to town felt like it took forever. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing me. When I finally got back to civilization, I parked the RV at Mike's place and sat there, trying to make sense of what happened. Mike came out and saw the scratches. "What the hell did you do to my RV?" he asked, half joking but with a worried look in his eyes. "I don't know, man. Something was out there. I can't explain it," I said, my voice shaking. He looked at me like I was crazy, but he didn't press the issue. I went home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't done with me. A few nights later, I had the same dream. I was back at the lake, sitting by the fire, and something was watching me from the trees. The dream felt so real that I'd wake up sweating, the sound of heavy breathing still echoing in my ears. I started doing some research, trying to figure out what it could have been. I read about all sorts of creatures and legends, but nothing matched exactly. The closest thing was a local legend about a creature called the Rock, a sort of forest spirit that was said to guard the woods. The stories were vague, but they all mentioned the same thing: deep scratches and the sense of being watched. I didn't go back to that lake, and I never camped alone again. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to find out. It's been years, and sometimes I still hear that low breathing in my dreams. Maybe it was just my imagination, but those scratches were real, and so was the fear. So that's my story. Believe it or not, it's what happened. Sometimes I think about going back, trying to find out more, but then I remember those nights and the terror that gripped me. Some things are better left alone, and that's it. I don't have all the answers, but I know one thing. I'm not going back to that lake. Not ever. The RV was our little escape. My buddy Craig and I had been taking these trips for years. He's the kind of guy who always has the best camping gear and knows all the off-the-beaten-path spots. This time, we headed to a place in the deep woods of northern Michigan. It was late fall, and the leaves were a mix of deep reds and golds, the air just crisp enough to need a jacket. We parked the RV in a small clearing near an old, rarely used trail. The first couple of days were just like any other trip. We fished in the nearby lake, hiked the trails, and spent our nights around the campfire, laughing about old stories. It was peaceful, away from the hustle of the city. One evening we decided to check out an abandoned cabin Craig had read about online. It was supposed to be about a mile hike from our spot, deeper into the woods. The sun was starting to set, but we figured we had enough daylight left. Besides, Craig had his flashlight, and I had my phone. The cabin was a wreck, moss-covered and falling apart. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. We poked around, finding nothing but some old furniture and a lot of dust. I was about to suggest heading back when Craig called out from another room. "Hey, Logan, come check this out." He was standing by an old rusted metal door that led to a cellar. It took both of us to get it open. Inside, there was a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. Craig, always the adventurous one, insisted we go down. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, feeling a bit uneasy. "Come on, man. What's the worst that could happen?" Craig replied with a grin. The cellar was damp and smelled like mold. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing a few old crates and what looked like an animal skeleton in one corner. Then we found something that sent chills through me, a set of rusty shackles attached to the wall. Craig looked at me, his excitement fading a bit. "This is messed up," I muttered. We didn't stay long after that. Climbing back up, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The sun had set by the time we emerged, and the forest around us was cloaked in shadows. We made our way back to the RV in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. That night, we tried to laugh off the weirdness over a few beers by the campfire, but the mood had shifted. Craig suggested we head back to the cabin the next day, maybe bring some better lights, but I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I woke up to find Craig gone. His sleeping bag was empty, and his boots were missing. I figured he'd gone for an early morning hike, something he often did, but by midday there was still no sign of him. I started to worry. Craig was always back by lunchtime. I grabbed my flashlight and a knife, just in case, and set out to look for him. I followed the trail we had taken to the cabin. Halfway there, I found one of Craig's boots lying in the middle of the path. It was covered in something dark, and I didn't want to think about what it might be. "Craig!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. There was no answer. I reached the cabin, but there was no sign of him. The cellar door was still open, and I felt a cold dread as I stared down into the darkness. I forced myself to go down the stairs, but the cellar was empty, just as we had left it. Back outside, I found more of Craig's things scattered in the underbrush, his other boot a torn piece of his jacket. It was like he had been dragged away. Panic started to set in. I had no idea what to do. I ran back to the RV, hoping he had somehow returned while I was gone, but it was empty. I grabbed the radio and tried to call for help, but the signal was weak. "Anyone out there? This is Logan Brooks. My friend is missing and I need help." Static was my only reply. I spent the next few hours searching the woods, calling out his name until my voice was hoarse. Just as I was about to give up and head back to the RV, I heard a noise, a rustling in the bushes behind me. I turned, shining my flashlight, and caught a glimpse of something moving. It was fast, too fast to be an animal. "Craig?" I called out, my heart pounding. There was no answer, but the rustling continued, moving closer. I gripped the knife tightly, backing away slowly. Suddenly, something charged at me from the darkness, knocking me to the ground. I struggled, kicking and swinging the knife blindly. Whatever it was strong and heavy, and I could feel its claws tearing into my flesh. I managed to stab it, and it let out a terrible screech before retreating into the woods. I scrambled to my feet, bleeding and shaking, and ran back to the RV as fast as I could. I locked the door behind me, my heart racing. I grabbed the first aid kit and did my best to patch myself up, but the wounds were deep. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, knife in hand, listening for any sound. The woods were eerily quiet. As dawn approached, I decided I needed to get out of there. Craig was still missing, but I couldn't stay. Whatever was out there, I wasn't equipped to deal with it. I packed up what I could, threw it into the RV, and started the engine. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see something chasing me, but there was nothing. Back in town, I went straight to the police. They organized a search party, but they didn't find anything. No sign of Craig, no sign of a struggle, nothing. They treated me like I was crazy, but I know what I saw, what I felt. Weeks passed, and the search was called off. Craig was declared missing, presumed dead. His family blamed me, and I couldn't blame them. I blamed myself, too. I moved away, tried to forget, but the nightmares never stopped. I could still feel the weight of that thing on top of me, its claws digging into my skin. I did some research, trying to find out what it could have been, but I never found a clear answer. Some locals had stories about strange creatures in the woods, tales of people going missing, but nothing concrete. One name kept coming up, though, in the old folklore, Gorgle. They said it was a creature that hunted in the night, taking people who wandered too far into the woods. I don't know if that's what it was, but it's the only name I have. Now, every time I see an RV or hear about someone planning a camping trip, I want to warn them. I want to tell them to stay away from those woods. But I don't, because who would believe me? Craig was my best friend, and I lost him to something I can't even explain. I can still see his smile, hear his laugh, but I can't bring him back. All I can do is remember and hope that no one else has to face Gorgle. My name is Russell Howard, and this happened to me on October 14th, 2006. It was supposed to be a quiet camping trip, just me and my RV out in the woods. I had been going to this spot near Blackford Reservoir in Idaho for years. It was peaceful, off the beaten path, and a great place to unwind. I arrived in the early afternoon, set up my RV, and got a fire going. The weather was perfect. Crisp air, the smell of pine, and the sound of leaves rustling. I settled into my usual routine, a cold beer, a campfire, and some music playing low. It was the kind of evening where you could forget about everything. As dusk fell, I noticed a couple of other RVs parked nearby. It wasn't unusual to see a few campers out here, but I preferred my solitude. A guy named Tom, his wife Linda, and their teenage son Josh were in one RV. In the other was an older man, John, who was friendly enough but seemed to keep to himself. We exchanged pleasantries and shared a few beers. Tom and Linda were regular folks out for a weekend getaway. John, on the other hand, was a bit of a mystery. He mentioned he was retired and enjoyed the quiet, but there was something about him that made me uneasy. Maybe it was his eyes, sharp and constantly scanning the surroundings. The first night passed without incident. I woke up early, brewed some coffee, and went for a hike. The woods were dense, but I had been through these trails countless times. I knew the area like the back of my hand. I returned to the campsite around noon, had some lunch, and decided to check on my neighbors. Tom and Linda were out fishing, but Josh was still at the campsite. We chatted for a bit, and I offered to teach him some basic survival skills. The kid seemed eager to learn, and it felt good to pass on some knowledge. The evening came, and we all gathered around the campfire again. This time, John joined us. He was quiet, just sipping his whiskey and staring into the flames. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. As I walked back to my RV, I felt a sudden chill. It was strange, but I shrugged it off as the cool night air. I woke up to a strange noise around 3 a.m. It sounded like something heavy being dragged through the forest. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The noise stopped. I stood there for a few minutes, listening. Nothing. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. The next morning, Tom and Linda were worried. Josh was missing. They said he had gone out for a walk after everyone went to bed and never came back. We searched the area, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. Tom wanted to call the authorities, but we had no cell signal out here. We decided to split up and cover more ground. John, surprisingly, offered to help. He seemed genuinely concerned, but there was still something about him that didn't sit right with me. We searched for hours, finding nothing but the untouched wilderness. It was late afternoon when we regrouped at the campsite. Tom and Linda were frantic, and John suggested we stay put and wait until morning, when we could drive to a spot with a signal. As the night wore on, tension hung heavy in the air. We sat around the campfire, barely speaking. The silence was oppressive. Around midnight, we heard it again, the dragging noise. This time it was closer. Tom grabbed a hunting knife from his RV and I picked up a heavy branch. We moved toward the sound, the fire casting long shadows behind us. John stayed back, watching with an unreadable expression. We reached the edge of the campsite when Tom froze. He pointed to a dark shape on the ground. As we got closer, the smell hit us first, metallic like blood. It was Josh. His body was twisted, his face a mask of terror. There were deep gashes on his arms and legs like he'd been mauled by something. Tom fell to his knees, screaming. Linda ran over and her wails pierced the night. I stood there, numb. This wasn't an animal attack. The wounds were too precise, too deliberate. John approached slowly, his face impassive. He looked at the body, then at us. "We need to leave," he said, his voice calm and cold. We packed up as quickly as we could, but Tom and Linda refused to leave Josh behind. They wrapped his body in a blanket and carried him to their RV. John insisted on driving ahead to get help, and I followed in my RV. The drive was a blur. My mind raced with what I'd seen. I kept replaying the events, trying to make sense of them. As we reached a spot with cell reception, I called the police. They arrived within an hour, taking statements and examining the scene. Tom and Linda were inconsolable. The police took Josh's body for an autopsy and assured us they'd do everything to find out what happened. We all drove to the nearest town, staying at a small motel. None of us slept that night. The next morning, the police visited us with more questions. They were thorough but had no answers. The autopsy report stated that the injuries were consistent with an animal attack, but I knew better. This was something else. Something far more sinister. John disappeared after that night. The police said he checked out early in the morning and left no forwarding address. It struck me as odd, but I was too exhausted to dwell on it. Months passed and life slowly returned to normal. Tom and Linda moved away, unable to stay in a place with so many painful memories. I continued camping, but never in that spot again. The woods, once my sanctuary, now felt like a place of danger. I kept thinking about that night, about John and his strange demeanor. There was something in his eyes, a darkness I couldn't shake. I started doing some research, digging into local legends and folklore. That's when I came across stories of a creature called Slocum. The name sent a shiver down my spine. Descriptions varied, but the common thread was a monstrous entity that stalked the forests, preying on the unsuspecting. Could it have been Slocum? I don't know. But what I do know is that something unnatural was out there that night. Something that took Josh and left us all haunted. I've stopped talking about it with friends. They don't understand, and I don't blame them. It's easier to pretend it never happened. But every time I hear a rustle in the woods or the call of an animal at night, I'm reminded of that terrible night. The night we lost Josh. The night I realized some things are better left unexplored, and some stories are best left untold. My name is Liam Nelson, and this happened to me on March 16, 1993. I've been driving trucks for almost 2 decades now, hauling everything from cattle to electronics across the United States. It's a solitary life, but it's one I've come to appreciate. There's something about the open road, the hum of the engine and the ever-changing scenery that brings a sense of peace, or at least it used to. That day, I was hauling a load of machinery parts from Kansas City to Salt Lake City. It was a long stretch, and I was about halfway through the trip when I pulled into a small, run-down truck stop just outside of Rock Springs, Wyoming. The place was called Eddie's Truck Haven, and it looked like it hadn't been renovated since the 60s. But it had fuel, food, and a place to rest for a bit, which was all I needed. I parked my rig, stretched my legs, and headed inside. The interior was as run down as the exterior, with peeling wallpaper and faded linoleum floors. There was a small diner area with a few booths and a counter where a bored-looking waitress in her 50s was reading a paperback novel. "Coffee, black," I said, sliding into a booth. She nodded, got up, and poured me a cup without a word. As I sipped the bitter brew, I noticed a couple of other truckers scattered around the diner. One was a burly guy with a thick beard, engrossed in his meal. Another was a lanky fellow fiddling with a napkin. I finished my coffee and decided to stretch my legs a bit more before hitting the road again. I walked around the back of the truck stop, where there was a small, overgrown lot. I was just about to head back when I saw something that caught my eye. It was an old, rusted-out sedan with its trunk slightly ajar. Something about it seemed off, so I walked over to take a closer look. The stench hit me first, rotting meat mixed with something even more putrid. I gagged and stepped back, but my curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a rag from my pocket, covered my nose, and lifted the trunk lid. Inside was a sight that would haunt me forever. A young woman's body, twisted and broken, lay crammed into the small space. Her face was contorted in pain, her eyes wide open. She was wearing a tattered dress, and there were deep gashes on her arms and legs. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. I ran back into the truck stop, shouting for someone to call the police. The waitress looked up, alarmed, and the burly trucker dropped his fork. Within minutes, the place was buzzing with activity as the local sheriff and his deputies arrived. Sheriff Johnson was a grizzled man in his late 50s with a no-nonsense attitude. He questioned me thoroughly, making sure I hadn't tampered with the scene. I told him everything I knew, which wasn't much. The deputies cordoned off the area and started their investigation. "You're not from around here, are you?" the sheriff asked, eyeing my rig. "No, just passing through," I replied. "Found the body while stretching my legs." He nodded, then turned to one of his deputies. "Get statements from everyone here. I want to know if anyone saw anything suspicious." I spent the next few hours hanging around the truck stop, watching the investigation unfold. They took my statement and eventually told me I could go, but to stay in touch in case they needed more information. As I climbed back into my truck, I couldn't shake the image of that poor woman from my mind. Who was she? How did she end up in that trunk? And who could do something so horrific? I continued my journey, but the usual peace of the open road was gone. Every mile brought new questions and new fears. I couldn't help but glance in my mirrors, half expecting to see someone following me. A few days later, I was in a rest area in Utah, trying to get some sleep. It was late, and the place was nearly empty. I had just started to drift off when I heard a soft tap on my window. Groggy, I sat up and peered out. A young woman stood there, looking distressed. "Hey, can you help me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "My car broke down and my phone's dead. Can I use yours to call for help?" Something about her seemed familiar, but I couldn't place it. I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Sure, let me grab it." I reached for my phone, but when I turned back, she was gone, vanished into the night. I got out of the truck, looking around, but there was no sign of her. Unease settled over me like a heavy blanket. Was she real? Had I imagined it? I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I decided to call Sheriff Johnson to see if there had been any updates on the case. He was tight-lipped, saying only that they were following leads, and that I should keep an eye out for anything unusual. A few more days passed, and I was back on the road, heading towards Denver. I had just pulled into another truck stop, this one in the middle of nowhere, when I noticed something odd. A familiar, rusted-out sedan was parked near the edge of the lot. The trunk was closed this time, but I knew it was the same car. My heart raced as I approached it, half expecting to find another body, but the trunk was empty. I looked around, feeling eyes on me, but saw no one. I decided to head inside the truck stop to see if anyone knew anything about the car. The inside was dimly lit, with a few truckers nursing their meals. I approached the counter, where a burly man with a name tag that read Bud was cleaning a glass. "Hey, the car outside, do you know whose it is?" I asked. Bud looked up, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, it's been here a couple of days. Belongs to a drifter, I think." "Why?" I hesitated, then told him about the body I'd found in a similar car. His eyes widened and he leaned in closer. "You don't think?" "I don't know," I replied, "but something doesn't feel right." I left the truck stop, my mind racing. I decided to stay close to my truck and keep an eye on the car. Hours passed and night fell. I was just about to give up and get some rest when I saw movement near the sedan. A tall figure, dressed in dark clothes, was standing by the car, looking around. I watched as he opened the trunk and placed something inside. My blood ran cold. I had to know what he was up to. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly approached, keeping to the shadows. The figure seemed to sense my presence and turned sharply, but I ducked behind a nearby truck. After a tense few moments, he went back to whatever he was doing. When he finally walked away, I crept up to the car and shone my flashlight into the trunk. It was empty. Confused, I turned to leave when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, my heart pounding. The tall figure stood there, his face obscured by a hood. Before I could react, he swung a heavy object at me. Pain exploded in my head, and I fell to the ground, my vision swimming. When I came to, I was lying in the dirt, my head throbbing. The car was gone, and so was my flashlight. I struggled to my feet and stumbled back to my truck, my mind a blur of pain and fear. I knew I had to call the sheriff again, but my phone was missing too. Panic set in as I realized the figure had taken it. I climbed into my truck and locked the doors, my hands shaking. I needed to get out of there to find help. I started the engine and drove away, glancing in my mirrors constantly. Every pair of headlights made my heart race. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. I drove until I reached a larger town and found a payphone. Sheriff Johnson answered on the second ring. I told him everything, my voice trembling. He listened quietly, then assured me they would send someone to investigate. "Stay safe, Liam," he said, "and keep your eyes open." The next few days were a blur. I finished my delivery and decided to take a few days off. The open road had lost its appeal, replaced by a constant sense of dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then, one evening, as I was sitting in a motel room, my phone rang. It was Sheriff Johnson. "Liam, we've got a lead," he said. "The car you described was found abandoned near an old barn outside of town. We're heading there now. Thought you might want to know." I thanked him and hung up, a mix of relief and apprehension washing over me. I decided to drive out to the barn, needing to see for myself. When I arrived, the place was swarming with deputies. Sheriff Johnson met me at the entrance, his expression grim. "We found something," he said, leading me inside. The barn was old and decrepit, filled with the scent of decay. In the center of the floor was a large blood-stained tarp. Johnson lifted a corner, revealing another body, this one a man, his face battered and bruised beyond recognition. "Do you know him?" Johnson asked. I shook my head, feeling sick. "No, but the car." "We're running the plates now," he said, "but there's more." He handed me a small, blood-stained notebook. I opened it, my eyes scanning the pages. It was filled with names, dates, and locations. Truck stops, rest areas, highways, and next to some of the names were notes. Missing, dead, found. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What does it mean?" "We think he was targeting truckers," Johnson said. "Following them, picking them off one by one. You might have been next." I nodded, my mind racing. The notebook was a grim reminder of the dangers that lurked in the most unexpected places. I handed it back to Johnson, feeling a strange mix of relief and sorrow. "Thank you, Sheriff," I said, "for everything." He nodded. "Take care, Liam, and stay safe out there." I left the barn, the weight of the past few days settling over me. The open road had changed, lost its allure, but I knew I couldn't let fear control me. I climbed back into my truck, started the engine, and drove away, determined to keep moving forward. As I drove, the miles stretched out before me, and I found a strange sense of peace. The road was still dangerous, still unpredictable, but it was also my home. And I wasn't ready to give it up just yet. So I kept driving, kept moving, 1 mile at a time, because sometimes that's all you can do. I always loved the idea of a getaway in nature, away from the chaos of daily life. So when my buddy, Alton Graves, suggested we take his new RV out for a weekend trip, I jumped at the chance. Alton and I had known each other since college. We both worked stressful jobs. He was in finance, and I managed a chain of restaurants. We needed a break. We picked a spot in the Chugach National Forest in Alaska. It wasn't the most popular location, which meant it was perfect for a quiet trip. We arrived late in the afternoon, parked the RV near a serene lake and set up a campfire. The sky was clear, the air was crisp, and it felt like the start of a perfect weekend. Alton was always the jokester. As we sat around the fire, he started telling some ridiculous story about a bear that could open beer cans with its teeth. I'm telling you, man, these bears are getting smarter. Next thing you know, they'll be hacking into our bank accounts. He laughed. I chuckled and took a sip of my beer. If a bear hacks into my account, it better pay my student loans. The night grew colder, and we decided to call it a night. We settled into the RV, with Alton taking the bed at the back and me on the pull-out couch in the main area. The sounds of the forest were oddly comforting, and I drifted off to sleep quickly. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange noise. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or the calls of nocturnal animals. This was something else, something closer. I listened intently, but it stopped. I figured it was just my imagination and went back to sleep. The next morning, Alton and I went for a hike. The trail was beautiful, lined with towering trees and the occasional glimpse of the lake through the foliage. We talked about everything and nothing, enjoying the peace and quiet. Ever think about quitting your job and just living out here? Alton asked, looking around. Every day, I replied. But then I remember I like hot showers and decent Wi-Fi. We laughed and continued on. The day passed uneventfully, with us exploring the area and taking in the scenery. By evening, we were back at the campsite, cooking dinner over the fire. As night fell, the noises of the forest returned. This time, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I didn't mention it to Alton, not wanting to ruin the trip with my paranoia. Around midnight, I heard the noise again. It was a low, guttural sound, like an animal, but more unsettling. I sat up and strained my ears, trying to locate the source. It seemed to be coming from the edge of the clearing near the tree line. "Alton, you awake?" I whispered. He groaned. "Yeah, what's up?" "Do you hear that?" He listened for a moment. "Probably just a raccoon or something. Go back to sleep." But I couldn't. I got up and grabbed the flashlight, deciding to check it out. "I'm going to take a look." "You're nuts, man," Alton mumbled, rolling over. I stepped outside, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The sound had stopped again, but I was determined to find out what it was. I walked slowly toward the tree line, my heart pounding. Suddenly, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. I swung the flashlight around, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I stood there for a moment, feeling like an idiot, and then I heard it again. This time, it was closer, right behind me. I turned around, and there it was. I could barely make it out in the darkness, but it was large, hunched over, and had a strange, almost human-like silhouette. Before I could react, it lunged at me, knocking me to the ground. I scrambled to my feet and ran back to the RV, slamming the door shut behind me. "Alton, wake up! There's something out there." He sat up, rubbing his eyes. "What the hell are you talking about?" "Something attacked me. I don't know what it is, but it's not a raccoon." He grabbed a knife from the kitchenette and handed it to me. "Stay here. I'll check it out." "No way, man. We stick together." We both stepped outside, knives in hand, and scanned the area with the flashlight. The forest was silent again, as if whatever it was had disappeared. We didn't see anything, but I knew what I had felt. It wasn't my imagination. We went back inside and locked the door. Neither of us slept much that night, listening for any sign of the creature. Morning came, and we decided to cut the trip short. It wasn't worth the risk. As we packed up, we noticed something disturbing. The ground near the RV was disturbed, as if something had been digging or dragging something heavy. There were strange marks, almost like claw marks in the dirt. "What do you think it was?" I asked, looking at Alton. "I don't know, but I'm not sticking around to find out." We got in the RV and started the drive back to civilization. As we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every now and then I would glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creature following us. We didn't talk much on the way back. When we finally reached the nearest town, we stopped at a diner to grab some food and collect our thoughts. The place was quiet, with only a few locals sitting at the counter. Alton and I took a booth in the corner. He ordered a coffee, and I got a burger. As we waited for our food, we tried to make sense of what had happened. "Do you think we should tell someone?" I asked. "Tell them what? That we saw some kind of monster in the woods? They'll think we're nuts." He had a point. Who would believe us? We barely believed it ourselves. Our food arrived, and we ate in silence, both of us lost in our thoughts. After we finished eating, we decided to go our separate ways. Alton had a long drive back to Anchorage, and I needed to get home and try to process everything. We agreed to keep in touch and let each other know if anything else strange happened. A few weeks passed, and life started to return to normal. The trip felt like a bad dream, something that happened in another lifetime. I was back at work, dealing with the usual stresses and trying to forget about that night in the forest. Then I got a call from Alton's sister. She was frantic, saying that Alton had gone missing. He hadn't shown up for work, and no one had heard from him in days. My heart sank. I knew it had something to do with whatever we encountered in the woods. I drove up to Anchorage to help with the search. The police were involved, and they were treating it as a missing persons case. They asked me a lot of questions about our trip, but I didn't tell them everything. I knew it sounded crazy, and I didn't want them to dismiss Alton's disappearance as a result of our overactive imaginations. We searched for weeks, but there was no sign of him. It was like he had vanished into thin air. The police eventually gave up, but I couldn't. I knew I had to find out what happened to him. One night I returned to the campsite. I parked the RV in the same spot and waited. The forest was just as I remembered, quiet and eerie. I didn't sleep, just sat there listening for any sound, any sign of the creature. Around midnight I heard it again, the same low, unsettling noise. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, my heart pounding in my chest. The noise grew louder, and I saw the same movement near the tree line. This time I didn't run. I stood my ground, determined to find out what this thing was. The creature emerged from the shadows, and I finally got a good look at it. It was tall, with long, gangly limbs and a face that was almost human, but twisted and grotesque. I raised the flashlight, and the beam caught its eyes. They glowed with an unnatural light, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The creature took a step toward me, and I braced myself for the worst. Suddenly it stopped. It tilted its head, as if studying me, and then it turned and disappeared back into the forest. I stood there trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I never saw the creature again, but I knew it was still out there. I named it Harbinger, because it felt like a warning, a sign that something terrible was lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Alton was never found, and I never went camping again. The forest held too many dark memories, too many unanswered questions. I moved on with my life, but I could never shake the feeling that the Harbinger was still out there, watching, waiting. Years later, I still think about that night. I wonder what would have happened if we had left earlier, if we had never gone on that trip. But most of all, I wonder if the Harbinger will ever come back, and if it does, what it will take from me next. My name is Vincent Gonzalez, and this happened to me on October 15th, 2011. I was taking a solo camping trip in my RV to the Ozark National Forest in Arkansas. I've always loved the outdoors, but this trip changed my view on camping forever. The plan was simple: drive out to a secluded spot, set up camp, and spend a few days fishing and hiking. The forest was dense with towering trees and thick underbrush, and the air was crisp and clean, the perfect getaway from my job as a mechanic in Little Rock. I parked my RV in a small clearing by a creek and set up camp. I spent the first day exploring the area. There were no other campers in sight, which was perfect for the peace I was seeking. I fished in the creek, catching a few trout for dinner. The silence was only broken by the sounds of nature, birds chirping, leaves rustling and the occasional splash of a fish. That evening, as the sun began to set, I built a fire and cooked my catch. The trout tasted fantastic, and I washed it down with a couple of beers. I sat by the fire enjoying the solitude, the stars starting to peek out in the clear sky. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The first sign that something was off came around midnight. I was woken by a sound outside the RV. It wasn't an animal. That much I could tell. It was a shuffling noise, like footsteps but irregular, as if someone or something was dragging a leg. I sat up in bed, straining to listen, but the sound stopped as abruptly as it had started. I shrugged it off, blaming my overactive imagination. After all, I was alone in the woods, and it was easy to let the mind play tricks. I fell back asleep, convincing myself it was nothing. The next morning I went out to check the area. Nothing seemed disturbed, so I chalked it up to a deer or some other wildlife passing through. I spent the day hiking deeper into the forest, marveling at the beauty of the place. By the time I got back to the RV, I was exhausted but content. I made another fire, cooked dinner, and settled in for the night. The shuffling came again that night, louder and closer this time. It was accompanied by a faint scratching sound, like nails on metal. It was coming from the back of the RV. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously opened the door, the cool night air hitting my face. I shone the light around, but there was nothing, just the trees standing silently, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. I went around to the back of the RV. The scratching had stopped, but I noticed something on the ground, a piece of what looked like old leather, frayed and torn. It was strange, but I couldn't make sense of it. I tossed it aside and went back inside, making sure to lock the door. The following day, I decided to stay closer to camp. I fished, read a book, and tried to ignore the unease growing in the pit of my stomach. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the familiar chill returned. I prepared myself for another night of strange sounds, but I wasn't prepared for what happened next. Around midnight, the shuffling and scratching returned, louder and more insistent. I lay in bed, holding my breath, when suddenly there was a thud against the side of the RV. I jumped up, grabbed my flashlight and a hunting knife, and cautiously opened the door again. This time the light caught a glimpse of something disappearing into the trees. It was fast, too fast for me to see clearly, but it was definitely not human. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped outside, my flashlight scanning the darkness. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small and shaky in the vast silence. No response, just the rustling of leaves. I decided to stay up and keep watch, sitting by the fire with my knife close by. The night stretched on, every sound amplified by my growing paranoia. I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of the fire crackling down to embers and the first light of dawn filtering through the trees. Relieved that nothing had happened, I convinced myself it was just a bear or some other animal curious about my camp. That evening, as the sun set, I felt a sense of dread. I cooked dinner, but my appetite was gone. I kept the fire going, sitting close to it with the knife in hand. The hours passed slowly, the forest around me growing darker and more menacing. Then it happened. Just after midnight, the shuffling returned, closer and more determined. The RV shook as something hit it hard, and I heard a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. I jumped up, flashlight and knife at the ready. The light revealed nothing at first, but then I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the trees. It was tall and gaunt, with long limbs and eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. I froze, unable to move, as it slowly stepped into the light. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its mouth was a grotesque gash filled with sharp, uneven teeth. It looked at me with those glowing eyes, and I felt a cold wave of terror wash over me. I backed away slowly, trying to keep the fire between us. The creature advanced, its movements jerky and unnatural. I realized then that it wasn't just curious, it was hunting. I threw a log from the fire at it, hoping to scare it off, but it barely flinched. Desperation took over, and I turned and ran into the RV, slamming the door behind me. I locked it and grabbed my shotgun from the closet, loading it with trembling hands. The creature slammed against the door, and I could hear its claws scraping the metal. I fired a shot through the door, hoping to hit it, but the banging continued. I fired again, and the noise stopped. I held my breath, listening intently. Had I scared it off? I waited for what felt like hours, but there were no more sounds. Exhausted and terrified, I finally drifted off to sleep, the shotgun still clutched in my hands. The morning light brought a temporary sense of relief. I cautiously opened the door and stepped outside. There were deep gouges in the metal where the creature had tried to get in, and the piece of torn leather was now clearly visible in the daylight. It wasn't leather at all, it was skin, dry and cracked like old parchment. I packed up my camp quickly, deciding it was time to leave. Whatever that thing was, I didn't want to be around to find out. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every noise a potential attack. I got back to Little Rock later that day and reported the encounter to the authorities. They didn't believe me, of course. Who would? They chalked it up to a bear or my imagination, but I knew what I saw, and I wasn't going back to those woods anytime soon. A few weeks later, I heard about a couple of hikers who had gone missing in the same area. Their bodies were never found, only their torn, blood-stained clothing. The news barely made a ripple, just another couple of missing persons in the wilderness. I couldn't get the creature out of my mind. I started researching local folklore and discovered that the Ozark forests have a history of strange disappearances and sightings of a creature known only as Scratch. The descriptions matched what I saw. Tall, gaunt, with glowing eyes and a mouth full of sharp teeth. I've never gone back to camping since that trip. The memory of those nights in the Ozarks haunts me. A constant reminder that there are things out there we don't understand, things that can turn a peaceful camping trip into a nightmare. So if you ever find yourself in the Ozark National Forest, remember to stay alert. You never know what might be watching you from the shadows. So there I was, parked in the middle of nowhere in my old RV. I'd been on the road for weeks, just looking to get away from the noise and hassle of life. My name's Travis Hawthorne, by the way. I'm a freelance graphic designer, so as long as I have my laptop and some Wi-Fi, I can work from anywhere. That's what brought me to the foothills of the Washoe Mountains in Arkansas. The spot was perfect, remote, quiet, surrounded by trees. It felt like I had the whole world to myself. The air was crisp, and the smell of pine filled my lungs. I could almost taste the freedom. I'd even managed to convince my buddy Jack to join me. He had taken some time off work and needed a break just as much as I did. Jack was a big guy, always cracking jokes, and he was pretty handy to have around. The first few days were bliss. We hiked during the day, fished in the nearby river, and at night we'd sit by the campfire sharing beers and stories. One evening, we were deep in a conversation about our high school days when we heard a rustling in the bushes. We both stopped talking and listened. "You hear that?" Jack said, his voice low. "Yeah, probably just a raccoon or something," I replied, though I felt a bit uneasy. We brushed it off and went back to our stories, but then it happened again, this time louder and closer. Jack stood up and grabbed a flashlight. "I'm going to check it out," he said, walking toward the noise. "Wait, man, it's probably nothing," I called after him, but he was already out of the circle of light from the fire. I watched his flashlight beam darting around the trees. After a minute, he came back, shaking his head. "Nothing there. Probably just an animal. Let's not freak ourselves out." We laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. We finished our beers and decided to call it a night. The next day, we hiked up to a ridge we'd spotted on the map. It was a tough climb, but the view was worth it. You could see for miles, endless forest stretching out in every direction. We sat there for a while, just taking it all in. On the way back, we stumbled upon an old abandoned cabin. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The roof was caved in on one side, and the windows were broken. Jack, always the adventurer, wanted to check it out. "Come on, Trav, let's see what's inside. Might find something cool." I was hesitant, but curiosity got the better of me. We pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. The place was a mess. Leaves and dirt covered the floor, and the furniture was broken and rotting. But what caught our attention was a pile of old newspapers in the corner. They were yellowed with age, but still readable. Jack picked one up and started flipping through it. "These are from the 70s. Weird. Why would someone leave all these here?" "Maybe they were using them for insulation or something," I suggested, though I wasn't sure. We didn't think much of it and headed back to the RV. That night, we heard the rustling again, but this time it was louder and more persistent. Jack grabbed his flashlight, and I followed him. We circled the RV, shining the light into the trees, but saw nothing. "This is getting creepy," Jack said. "Maybe we should pack up and leave tomorrow." I nodded, feeling the unease settle in my stomach. We went back inside and locked the door, something we hadn't bothered to do before. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud bang on the side of the RV. I shot up, my heart pounding. Jack was already up, holding a baseball bat. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. Jack shook his head. "I don't know, but I'm going to find out." He opened the door cautiously, bat in hand, and stepped outside. I followed, holding a kitchen knife, not the best weapon, but it was something. We crept around the RV, every shadow looking like it could jump out at us. Then we saw it, a figure, tall and hunched, darting between the trees. Jack shone his flashlight on it, and for a split second, we saw it clearly. It was like nothing I'd ever seen, a gaunt, almost skeletal figure with pale, taut skin and eyes that seemed to glow in the light. "Holy shit!" Jack yelled. The thing turned and bolted into the woods. We didn't sleep at all that night. We sat in the RV, weapons at the ready, jumping at every little sound. By morning we were both exhausted but determined to get out of there. We packed up our stuff as quickly as we could and hit the road. As we were driving, Jack turned to me. "What the hell was that thing, man?" "I have no idea. Maybe it was some kind of animal we've never seen before." "An animal?" "That thing looked like it came straight out of a nightmare." We drove in silence for a while, both lost in our thoughts. We were miles away from the campsite when we saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. Jack slammed on the brakes and we skidded to a stop. It was the same creature, standing there, staring at us with those glowing eyes. "Floor it, man!" I yelled, and Jack did just that. The creature didn't move, and we swerved around it, barely missing it. I looked back and saw it disappear into the trees. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town. We went straight to the local sheriff's office and told them what happened. They looked at us like we were crazy, but they agreed to send someone out to check the campsite. A few hours later, the sheriff called us back. They hadn't found anything, no tracks, no signs of anything unusual. It was like the creature had vanished into thin air. Jack and I decided to cut our trip short and head back home. We couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, and every little noise made us jump. When we got back to civilization, we did some research trying to figure out what we had seen. We found stories about strange creatures in the woods, but nothing matched what we saw. It was like this thing didn't exist, like it was something out of a nightmare. We tried to put it behind us, but it wasn't easy. A few weeks after we got back, I got a call from Jack. He sounded shaken. "Travis, I've been having nightmares. I keep seeing that thing in my sleep." "Me too, man. It's like it's haunting us." Jack sighed. "I don't know what to do. I can't sleep. I can't concentrate. It's like it's always there, just out of sight." We talked for a while, trying to reassure each other, but it was clear we were both still scared. One night I woke up to a noise outside my window. I grabbed the knife I kept by my bed and crept to the window. There it was, standing in the yard, staring at me with those glowing eyes. I froze, unable to move. Then it turned and disappeared into the night. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, and the next day I called Jack. We need to do something. This thing is following us. We can't let it control our lives. Jack agreed, and we decided to go back to the campsite to try and find some answers. We armed ourselves, Jack with his bat and me with a hunting rifle I'd borrowed from a friend. We drove back to the mountains, our nerves on edge the whole way. When we got to the campsite, everything was just as we'd left it. We set up camp and waited, our eyes scanning the trees. As night fell, the rustling started again. This time, we were ready. We saw the creature again, but this time it didn't run. It stood there watching us, almost like it was daring us to do something. Jack raised his bat and took a step forward. "Get the hell out of here!" he yelled. The creature didn't move. Jack took another step, and that's when it attacked. It moved so fast we barely had time to react. It was on Jack in an instant, knocking him to the ground. I raised the rifle and fired, but the bullets seemed to have no effect. Jack fought back with everything he had, but the creature was too strong. It pinned him down, its claws digging into his flesh. I fired again and again, but nothing seemed to stop it. Finally, with a strength I didn't know I had, I tackled the creature, knocking it off Jack. We fought, rolling on the ground, but it was like fighting a shadow. It was all over me, scratching and biting, and I could feel my strength fading. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, disappearing into the trees. I crawled over to Jack. He was bleeding badly, his face pale. "Jack, stay with me, man. We're getting out of here." I managed to get him to the RV and drove like a madman to the nearest hospital. They took him into surgery, but it was too late. Jack didn't make it. The doctors asked what happened, but I couldn't tell them the truth. Who would believe me? They ruled it as an animal attack, a bear or something, but I knew better. I went back to the campsite one last time, hoping to find some clue, something that would make sense of what happened. I found nothing. It was like the creature had never been there. I've never been able to shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching, waiting. I don't go camping anymore, and I keep a gun by my bed. I tell myself it was just a nightmare, that it couldn't have been real. But deep down, I know the truth. It's out there, and it has a name. Grindle. It's been years since that night, but the memories are as vivid as ever. I still see Jack's face, still hear his screams. I've tried to move on, but some things you just can't forget. Some things follow you, no matter how far you run. Not many people understand the silence of the deep woods at night. My name is Jeremy Harris, and back in 2018, I found myself trekking through the Carpathian Mountains of Romania. It's funny, while most folks picture Green Berets diving out of planes or sneaking into enemy compounds, I was more likely to be found with a map in one hand and a protein bar in the other, cursing under my breath about blisters. I was part of a small team sent to locate a missing NATO reconnaissance unit. They'd gone radio silent in a region notorious for its rugged terrain and folklore that locals whispered about but never fully explained. My teammates, Lysander Cole and Magnus Reed, were seasoned professionals with a penchant for dark humor. Lysander once joked that if the army didn't pay us, he'd do this job for free just for the storytelling rights. Magnus was the quiet type, but had a laugh that could shake leaves off trees. The mission seemed straightforward. Hike in, find the missing soldiers, and get out. But as any soldier will tell you, straightforward is military slang for something's bound to go wrong. We started our ascent at dawn, the forest canopy above us filtering the sunlight into a mosaic of greens and golds. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. It would have been almost idyllic, if not for the uneasy feeling gnawing at the back of my mind. "Did you hear the one about the soldier who quit his job to become a baker?" Lysander piped up. "He couldn't make enough dough." I chuckled. "Keep your day job, Cole." Magnus smirked but kept his eyes on the trail. "Save the jokes for when we're not hunting ghosts." "Who said anything about ghosts?" I asked. Lysander shrugged. Locals did. Said the mountains are alive with spirits and creatures that don't take kindly to uninvited guests. Superstitious nonsense, Magnus muttered. We pressed on, but the further we went, the more the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees grew taller, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. The underbrush thickened, and the usual sounds of wildlife faded into an oppressive silence. By late afternoon, we reached the coordinates where the unit was last reported. The area was a small clearing with a babbling brook cutting through it, but something was off. Equipment was strewn about, rifles, torn backpacks, scattered rations, but no sign of the soldiers. Stay sharp, I said, scanning the perimeter. Lysander knelt to inspect a rifle. Safety's off. They left in a hurry. Magnus moved toward a torn backpack, lifting it carefully. Claw marks. I frowned. Bears? He shook his head. Too large. And bears don't usually attack groups unless provoked. Maybe they were provoked, Lysander suggested. Spread out, I ordered, but stay within sight. We combed the area, looking for any clues. Then I saw it, a set of tracks leading into the denser part of the forest. They were unlike anything I'd seen before. The footprints were elongated, with 4 distinct toe marks and deep impressions suggesting significant weight. Guys, take a look at this, I called out. They joined me, and Lysander let out a low whistle. What in the world made those? Magnus knelt beside the prints. They're fresh. A rustling noise came from the trees behind us. We spun around, weapons raised, but saw nothing. Probably just the wind, I said, though I didn't believe it. Wind doesn't make footprints, Lysander replied. Dusk began to settle, and the forest took on an eerie quality. Shadows stretched longer, and the temperature dropped. We decided to set up a temporary camp to regroup and plan our next move. As we ate our MREs in silence, Lysander tried to lighten the mood. At least the stars are out. Could be worse. We could be back at base listening to Sergeant Mullins snore. Magnus cracked a small smile. I'd take Mullins snoring over this silence any day. I agree, I said, but kept my thoughts to myself. Something was wrong, and every instinct told me we weren't alone. The night shift. In the middle of the night, I awoke to a faint sound, branches snapping under heavy weight. I sat up, gripping my rifle. The campfire had dwindled to embers, casting a dim glow. Did you hear that? Lysander whispered from his sleeping bag. Yeah, I replied. Magnus? No answer. I moved to his spot, but he was gone. His gear was still there, his sleeping bag unzipped. He's probably answering nature's call, Lysander said, though his voice wavered. Not without his weapon, I noted. We waited a few minutes, but Magnus didn't return. A sense of dread settled in. Stay here, I told Lysander. I'm going to look for him. No way. We stick together. I nodded, and we both ventured into the woods, calling out softly for Magnus. The forest seemed to absorb our voices. Then we found it, a patch of disturbed earth, broken branches and blood spattered across the leaves, dark and glistening. Lysander paled. This isn't good. I crouched down, examining the area. No drag marks. Whatever happened, it was quick. A low, guttural noise echoed through the trees. We spun around, hearts pounding. Did you hear that? Lysander whispered. I nodded, signaling for silence. We moved cautiously, following the sound. Then we saw something that made my blood run cold. In a small clearing ahead, a massive figure loomed over what looked like Magnus's body. The creature was hunched, with a muscular frame covered in matted fur. It reminded me of a grizzly bear, but it stood upright like a human, with elongated limbs and claws that glinted in the moonlight. What is that? Lysander breathed. I had no answer. The creature lifted its head, and even from a distance I could sense its predatory gaze. We need to fall back, I whispered. As we started to retreat, Lysander stepped on a dry twig. Snap! The creature's head whipped in our direction, and it let out a roar that shook me to my core. Run! I shouted. We bolted through the trees, branches whipping against our faces. Behind us, the sound of heavy footfalls closed in. Head for the ridge! I yelled, hoping higher ground would give us an advantage. We scrambled up the rocky incline, our boots slipping on loose stones. At the top, we paused to catch our breath. Did we lose it? Lysander asked between gasps. A deafening silence answered. Then, without warning, the creature burst from the trees below, scaling the ridge with alarming speed. "Keep moving," I urged. We sprinted along the ridge, but Lysander stumbled, falling hard. "My ankle," he grimaced. I rushed to help him up, but it was too late. The creature was upon us. It swiped at Lysander, its claws tearing through his vest like paper. He screamed, a sound that will haunt me forever. I raised my rifle and fired. The bullet struck the beast, but barely slowed it down. It turned its attention to me, and I saw its eyes, cold and intelligent. Desperate, I grabbed a flare from my pack and ignited it, thrusting the burning light toward the creature. It recoiled, snarling. "Lysander!" I shouted, but he lay motionless. Knowing there was nothing more I could do for him, I ran. The terrain was treacherous and exhaustion clawed at me, but adrenaline pushed me forward. As dawn broke, I stumbled upon an old cabin nestled among the trees. It was dilapidated, but it offered shelter. I burst inside, barricading the door with a heavy wooden beam. The interior was sparse. An old table, a rusted stove, and a small window covered with grime. I peered outside, seeing no sign of the creature. "Just like a bad horror movie," I muttered to myself. I took stock of my ammunition, limited at best. My radio was damaged, likely from the frantic escape. Hours passed, and the daylight provided little comfort. I searched the cabin for anything useful, finding a rusty hunting knife and a canteen with stale water. As evening approached, a sound outside caught my attention, a soft scratching along the wall. My heart pounded as I gripped my rifle tighter. "Come on, Jeremy, think," I whispered. An idea formed. I took the remaining flares and set them near the entrance. If the creature tried to break in, I'd have a surprise waiting. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, then silence. I waited, every muscle tense. Suddenly the creature smashed through the window, shards of glass spraying across the room. It lunged toward me, and I rolled out of the way, knocking over the table to create a barrier. Up close, the creature's features were more distinct. Its face resembled a wolf, but distorted, with a maw full of sharp teeth and eyes that seemed almost human. It was as if nature had cobbled together a predator from nightmares. "You're one ugly beast," I said, trying to steady my shaking hands. It growled, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated in my chest. I lit a flare and threw it at the creature. It struck its shoulder, flames licking at its fur. The beast howled in pain and rage. Seizing the moment, I fired several rounds into its torso. This time, it staggered, black ichor seeping from the wounds, but it wasn't done yet. With a fierce swipe, it knocked the rifle from my hands and sent me crashing against the wall. Pain shot through my back, but I scrambled to my feet, pulling out the rusty knife. "Not how I pictured going out," I muttered. The creature charged. I sidestepped and plunged the knife into its side. It roared, thrashing wildly. The cabin's old wooden beams groaned under the chaos. We grappled, and I could feel its hot breath on my face. Desperate, I reached for a broken piece of wood and jammed it into its eye. The beast recoiled, giving me enough space to make a dash for the door. Bursting outside, I didn't look back. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out. The forest began to thin, and I spotted a dirt road ahead. A vehicle's engine rumbled in the distance. Summoning the last of my strength, I stumbled onto the road, waving my arms. An old pickup truck screeched to a halt. The driver, a weathered man with a thick beard, looked at me in shock. "Help," I managed to say before collapsing. I awoke in a small clinic in a nearby village, bandages wrapped around my torso and an IV drip attached to my arm. The room smelled of antiseptic and something herbal. The doctor entered, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes. "You're lucky to be alive," she said in accented English. "Luck had little to do with it," I replied. She gave me a puzzled look but didn't press further. "You need rest. Did anyone else come through? My teammates?" She shook her head. "No one else has been found." I closed my eyes, a mix of sorrow and relief washing over me. A week later, I was debriefed by military officials. They pressed for details, but I could tell they were skeptical of my account. It was some kind of animal, I insisted. Nothing I've ever seen before. They exchanged glances. We'll look into it. One of them said curtly. I knew what that meant. The incident would be buried, explained away as a bear attack or a case of disorientation leading to friendly fire. As I prepared to leave, the official handed me a file. You're being reassigned stateside, effective immediately. I nodded, taking the paperwork. Understood. Walking out of the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that the real threat remained out there, hidden in those ancient woods. Back home, I tried to return to normalcy. One evening, I visited a local bar, hoping a drink might dull the edges of my memories. As I sipped my whiskey, a news report flashed on the TV about unexplained livestock deaths in rural Romania. I smirked wryly. Looks like they're still having animal problems, I muttered. The bartender raised an eyebrow. You say something? Just talking to myself, I replied. He chuckled. Careful with that. People might think you're crazy. Crazy wouldn't be the first time. I left the bar and stepped into the cool night air. Stars dotted the sky, indifferent to the troubles below. As I walked down the quiet street, a stray dog crossed my path. It paused to look at me, its eyes reflecting the streetlights. Not tonight, buddy, I said, giving it a wide berth. Reaching my apartment, I unlocked the door and entered the familiar surroundings. Tossing my keys on the table, I glanced at the stack of unread mail. Among the envelopes was a postcard with no return address. It featured a photograph of the Carpathian Mountains. I turned it over. Scrawled in neat handwriting were the words, "Some things are better left alone." I stared at the card, a mix of confusion and unease settling in. Was it a warning? A threat? Shaking my head, I decided I'd had enough mysteries for one lifetime. I tore the postcard in half and tossed it in the trash. Curiosity killed the cat, I muttered, heading to the kitchen. As I opened the fridge, I noticed a small scratch on my forearm, probably from the scuffle in the cabin. It had almost healed but left a thin, pale line. I shrugged it off, just another scar to add to the collection. The phone rang, jolting me from my thoughts. I answered, half expecting it to be a wrong number. "Mr. Stone?" a voice asked. "Speaking. This is Dr. Kovat from the clinic in Romania. I wanted to inform you that we've analyzed the samples you left behind." I frowned. "Samples?" "Yes, the tissue you extracted from the animal." "I didn't leave any samples." There was a pause. "Perhaps there's a misunderstanding. In any case, the results are unusual. We'd like to discuss them with you." I felt a chill run down my spine. "I'm not interested." "Very well. But should you change your mind, you know how to reach us." I hung up, unsettled by the call. So how had they gotten my number? And what samples were they talking about? Deciding it was best to let it go, I headed to bed. Sleep came reluctantly, filled with disjointed images of forests and shadows. The next morning I found a small package at my door. No markings, no postage. Inside was a vial containing a dark substance and a note. "The truth cannot be ignored." I sealed the package and set it aside. Some mysteries are best left unsolved. Later that day, as I walked through the park, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I turned, seeing only families and joggers going about their day. Paranoia doesn't suit you, I told myself. But as I continued, I spotted a figure in the distance, a man leaning against a tree, his gaze fixed on me. He wore a hooded jacket, obscuring his features. I changed direction, heading toward a more crowded area. When I glanced back, he was gone. Reaching a busy street, I felt a bit more at ease. Maybe it was all in my head. Then a hand clapped on my shoulder. I spun around to see Lysander grinning at me. "Miss me?" he said. I stumbled back, heart racing. "But you're dead." "Not quite." He stepped closer, his eyes flickering with a familiar, unsettling glint. "What's going on?" I demanded. He smirked. "Some things you can't escape, Jeremy." Before I could react, he melted into the crowd, disappearing among the throngs of people. I stood there, confusion and disbelief battling within me. Had I imagined it? Was stress getting the better of me? One thing was clear, the past wasn't done with me yet. I decided it was time to take matters into my own hands. Returning home, I retrieved the package and the torn postcard. Maybe the answers lay back where it all started. Sometimes the only way out is through.